Dimensional Trader in Marvel Chapter 1. Selling gold in February. Chicago was still cold. Although it was now 1943, and the war in Europe and Asia was raging on, Chicago, far from the battlefield and one of America's most important industrial cities, remained bustling and vibrant. During the day, the streets were filled with cars, the shops were dazzling, and gentlemen and ladies moved about, creating a lively atmosphere not much different from the 21st century. If it weren't for the occasional war posters scattered around the streets, it would be hard to believe that, on the other side of the world, the largest and deadliest war in history was taking place. But none of this mattered to Josh. Wrapped in a coat too large for him, Josh crossed the busy streets and entered a shop on the side of the road. "Take a look around if you need anything," said the elderly shopkeeper without raising his head, accompanied by the crisp sound of the bell above the door. This was a general store, selling everything from small items like scissors and cutlery to large items like radios and vinyl records, all neatly arranged in their respective places. However, Josh wasn't here to buy anything, he was here to sell. "I heard you buy gold," Josh said directly, walking to the counter and addressing the old shopkeeper, who was fiddling with an old radio. Hearing this, the old man finally raised his head slightly, glanced at Josh, surprised to see a boy around 15 or 16 years old, but he still nodded. Without hesitation, Josh reached into his coat and pulled out a pouch, placing it on the counter and revealing the gold jewelry inside. It looks a bit like Native American craftsmanship, but not quite." "Where did you get it?" the old man asked, surprised as he examined the gold. "Why, would Native American craftsmanship make it worth more?" Josh replied without answering the question. "Not really. It doesn't appeal to mainstream tastes," the old man shrugged. The mainstream aesthetic, of course, was the white man's aesthetic. The rough, native style of craftsmanship would hardly catch the attention of wealthy ladies. The fate of this gold was likely to be melted down. "How much can you offer?" Josh asked again. He didn't care about the craftsmanship because he knew it wasn't actually Native American gold. "Don't rush, kid, wait a moment," the old shopkeeper reassured him before calmly turning to fetch some tools. Josh wasn't in a hurry either. Before coming here, he had done his research. This was a well-known old general store in the area, and it also served as a pawnshop. And what he was selling was just gold, not illegal items. Well, technically, according to a law passed by Roosevelt 10 years ago, private gold trading was illegal. This law wouldn't be fully repealed until Nixon's time, more than 20 years later. But in reality, since the start of World War II, this law was no longer enforced as strictly as it once was. Additionally, with the influx of refugees during the war, the U.S. government had turned a blind eye to small-scale gold trading, making such transactions quite common. Of course, the safest option was to sell the gold to a bank at the official rate of $35 per ounce, which equates to about 28 grams. But that would be a huge loss. The market price for gold had already risen to $50 per ounce. A $15 difference was no small amount. Given the purchasing power of the dollar in this era, it was substantial. For example, in a big city like Chicago, a full meal at a typical restaurant, with coffee, meat, and vegetables, would cost only 50 to 60 cents, while a large hamburger was around 20 cents. In other words, for the average person, $15 was enough for over a week of eating out. Josh's gold wasn't a large amount, but it wasn't small either, 10 ounces. That was a $150 difference, which was about 2 to 3 months of income for the average person. Don't be fooled by the fact that the average annual income in America had already surpassed $1,000 by 1943. Anyone who understands what average means knows the reality. In fact, in the city, an annual income of $700 or $800 was considered a good salary. Why did so many young Americans enthusiastically enlist during World War II? It was because the military offered good pay. A private's base pay was $50 a month, and with each promotion in rank, their salary increased by $10 to $20. By the time someone became a sergeant, they could earn $100 a month, not including various allowances. So $150 was no small amount. Josh's gold wasn't a lot, but he wasn't willing to forfeit such a significant difference to the American banks, so he was willing to take a bit of risk. Fortunately, the old shopkeeper didn't pull any tricks and soon returned with tools, measuring cups, water, a balance scale, and so on. The purity of this gold isn't very high, only about 80%. I can offer you $40 for it, the old man concluded after measuring the gold. Deal. Josh wasn't surprised by this. He knew the gold's purity couldn't be too high, given the primitive metallurgy of the world it came from, especially from barbarians who couldn't even smelt steel. So Josh quickly agreed to the price. Very good, 9.8 ounces in total. I won't shortchange you, I'll round it up to 10 ounces. Here's $400. Take it, kid. The old man, seeing Josh's swift agreement, didn't delay either. He pulled out a roll of dollars from behind the counter, took out 2 bills, and handed the rest to Josh. Josh took the roll of money, unwrapped the rubber band, and counted. 8 $50 bills, exactly the right amount. After all, the US hadn't yet entered the credit card era, so large bills weren't uncommon. Unlike in the 21st century, where $50 bills were rare. Change $50 for me, preferably in $5 bills, $10 bills if necessary, Josh said after confirming the money was real, pushing $50 back toward the old man. While large bills weren't rare, having some smaller change on hand was more convenient given the high purchasing power of the dollar. The old man didn't say much, simply nodded, and exchanged it for a roll of $5 bills. After counting and confirming everything was in order, Josh tied the money back up, put it in his pocket, and prepared to leave. If you have more goods, feel free to come back. I am the best dealer around here. The old man's voice called out as Josh was about to step out the door. Of course, Josh replied with a slight pause and nod before leaving. Chapter 2. Josh, the time traveler. After leaving the shop and carefully walking through 2 blocks, Josh finally breathed a sigh of relief when he confirmed that no one was following him. He then walked into a decent-looking restaurant on the roadside. It had been a week since he arrived in this world. The best meal he'd had so far was just a hamburger. Now that he finally had some money, he naturally wanted to treat himself to a proper meal. Yes, there was no doubt, Josh was a time traveler. TN. He doesn't know that he is in Marvel. He thinks that he is in his original world. In his previous life, he had been a young white-collar worker in a third-tier city in China in the 21st century. One night, after just having a few drinks with a heartbroken friend, Josh woke up to find himself in 1943, in Chicago, as a 15-year-old boy living on the streets. It seems God had taken some pity on him. In his previous life, although Josh wasn't from a wealthy family, he was a middle-class young man with a car, a house, and a comfortable life. He was in his early 30s, the prime of his life. Sure, he read online novels occasionally, but he never imagined something like time travel would happen to him. In fact, it was his friend, who had failed at starting a business and been dumped by his girlfriend of 8 years, who seemed to fit the typical time travel protagonist mold. Shouldn't it have been him instead? Maybe the gods just picked the wrong person. Now, here he was in 1943, stuck in Chicago, where he had landed in the proverbial orphanage of protagonists, scraping by from meal to meal. TN. Proverbial orphanage of protagonists means he is comparing himself to other protagonists in novels who transmigrated and were often orphaned. The only advantage was that he had become 15 years old again, gaining several extra years of life for free. But living longer wasn't necessarily a gift. Given the environment of this era, it was hard to say how long he would actually survive. Another piece of good news was that his original body wasn't an orphan by birth. His parents had passed away in an accident less than 6 months ago. They had been legitimate U.S. citizens, not undocumented individuals. Although his parents hadn't left him much in the way of inheritance, they did leave him a small apartment, so at least he wasn't homeless. Entering the restaurant, Josh didn't order anything too extravagant. A large American-style meatloaf, some fries, macaroni and cheese, a salad, and a big glass of Coca-Cola. It was a standard blue-collar American meal, and the portions were generous. TN. A blue-collar worker is a working-class person who performs manual labor or skilled trades. Blue-collar work may involve skilled or unskilled labor. As for the taste, it was decent enough. What surprised Josh, though, was the taste of the Coca-Cola. It was much richer than the Coca-Cola he remembered from the future. Since he was in the middle of a growth spurt, Josh quickly devoured everything. When he finished and paid the bill, it came to 75 cents. Cheap. Not really. If you calculated it based on the official gold exchange rate, this meal would be equivalent to over $30 in the early 21st century. If it had been a few years ago, during the Great Depression, such a meal wouldn't have cost more than 50 cents. The reason prices were high now was due to wartime shortages of goods. That's right, because of the need to support the war efforts in Europe and Asia. Even the United States, though untouched by the flames of war, had seen a surge in prices since 1941. In May 1942, a nationwide rationing system had been introduced. Everyone was issued a ration book, which included 48 blue points and 64 red points in the form of plastic tokens each month. The blue points were used to buy processed goods like canned and bottled items, while the red points were for meat, fish, and dairy products. Ordinary citizens could only buy goods in line with their ration allowances. Only stores and restaurants had larger allocations, as the rest of the resources went directly to the front lines. At the front lines, a typical soldier's ration was 3 to 4 times that of an ordinary civilian. It could be said that everything was prioritized for the war effort. This rationing system would last until the latter half of 1944, when America's industrial production peaked, leading to surplus supplies. Only then would the restrictions be gradually lifted. Of course, just like with the bootlegging rum running, or bootlegging, is the illegal business of smuggling alcoholic beverages where such transportation is forbidden by law. Business 20 years ago, if you were willing to spend money, you could always get your hands on more goods. After finishing his meal, Josh left the restaurant. Once he confirmed again that no one was paying attention to him, he relaxed and strolled down the street before hailing a taxi. Don't be surprised. There were taxis in Shanghai during this period, so naturally, America had them as well. He gave the driver an address, and the car set off. Soon, he arrived at a used car dealership. As the world's leading industrial power at the time, America's car ownership was astonishing. By 1937, the rate had already reached 25%. That meant 1 out of every 4 Americans owned a car. Most of these cars were concentrated in major cities. And in a big industrial city like Chicago, the numbers were even higher. Cars weren't that expensive either. A brand new basic Ford Model A only cost $500 to $600. However, since America formally entered World War II, all major companies had been temporarily banned from producing civilian cars, focusing instead on military vehicles. As a result, new cars were hard to come by, and, like other goods, they were rationed. Only special professions like doctors and priests could get a car allocation. Gasoline and tires were also subject to rationing. Compared to those, a driver's license was the least of Josh's worries. Although some basic traffic laws had been enacted more than a decade ago due to the high number of cars on the road, they were still relatively loose. Even though Josh was a bit underage, with a little extra cash, he could still get his hands on a driver's license. Josh wasn't aiming for a new car anyway. A second-hand car in good condition would do. Chicago was a big city, and having a car would make things much more convenient. Plus, while gasoline and tires were rationed, as mentioned before, with enough money, you could get whatever you needed. In the end, Josh bought a second-hand Ford with a full tank of gas and in good condition for $200. That purchase cut his assets nearly in half, leaving him with $200. Once he got the car, Josh hit the road. Honestly, after driving automatic cars in his past life, switching to a vintage manual car took some getting used to. But traffic rules weren't as strict as they would be later on, so Josh managed to drive without much trouble. Soon, Josh drove to a somewhat secluded gun shop. Walking in, he was greeted by a wide variety of firearms. Though guns in this era weren't as advanced as those in the future, it was important to remember that the US hadn't enacted an automatic weapons ban yet. That law wouldn't come until 1986. So in this gun shop, there were not only light automatic weapons like the Thompson submachine gun, M1918 Browning, and Colt automatic pistols, but even heavy machine guns like the Colt M1895 were available. However, Josh could only admire those from a distance. They were far too expensive. Early Thompson models were outrageously expensive, with a single gun costing over $200. Though the price had come down over the years, it still cost more than $70 at the official purchase price. Due to the war, even retail prices had risen, with the sticker price now at $108. With Josh's limited funds, he could barely afford two, let alone the cost of ammunition. M1 Garands were even pricier, with a retail price of $150, way out of his budget, so Josh set his sights on an older rifle from World War I, not the Springfield rifle. Due to its excellent performance, the Springfield was still in heavy use during World War II, leading to high demand and a steep price. Instead, Josh was after the M1917, a rifle made as a supplemental model to the Springfield. Because of its simpler structure, the M1917 had been mass-produced during World War I. After the war, most were retired, with a portion sold and over 1 million units placed in storage. During World War II, this rifle was reissued but mainly used for foreign aid or training purposes, not in actual combat. As a result, there were still plenty available in the US, making them cheap. You could get one, along with 1,000 rounds of ammunition, for just $45, a real bargain. At this time, many Americans who hunted or participated in shooting competitions preferred to buy this rifle. "What can I get you, sir?" asked the plump gun shop owner. Beside him stood a young man around Josh's age, also chubby, probably the owner's son. "I'll take 4 M1917s, and a Colt M1911, Josh replied directly. The rifles were for selling, while the M1911 was for his own self-defense. The shop owner seemed a bit surprised that Josh was buying 4 rifles at once, but he didn't ask any questions. Having lived through the Great Depression, he had seen all kinds of things. Even John Dillinger had bought guns from him back in the day. As long as the customer paid, what they did with the guns was none of his business. Chapter 3. Dimensional Trading System. After asking the shopkeeper to help load the guns into the car and paying for them, Josh drove away. However, after making a few turns, he pulled over, ran his hand over all the guns and bullets, and everything instantly disappeared. Only then did he calmly resume driving. Half an hour later, Josh finally arrived home, and fortunately, he encountered no trouble along the way. Perhaps it was because many of the unemployed youth had gone off to enlist in the army, but Chicago's law and order seemed pretty good at this time. At least since Josh had arrived, he hadn't witnessed any major crimes. Nor had he seen scenes like in the gangster movies, where the mafia wielded Thompson submachine guns, spraying bullets in the streets. Of course, the fact that Josh hadn't seen it didn't mean it didn't happen. After all, whether it was the past 20 to 30 years or the next, these were the periods of rapid growth for the American mafia. Had Josh arrived just a few years earlier, scenes of gangsters in trench coats and fedoras, armed with Thompsons, causing mayhem on the streets would have been more common. The reason these scenes were rare now was partly due to the decent security in the areas Josh visited. In this era of enforced racial segregation, he didn't see any black people on the streets either. Another factor was the war. Don't think the war and the mafia were unrelated. They were very much connected. One reason, as Josh imagined, was that a lot of the street-tough youths had gone off to war, reducing the fresh blood the gangs could recruit. Secondly, most of the gangsters were too busy making money. Why do people join gangs? Ultimately, it's to make money, right? And what was the easiest money to make during wartime? Smuggling. No, it wasn't even called smuggling anymore. It was called transportation. During the war, to support the European conflict and because of the huge risks involved in sea transport, the US had almost completely lifted restrictions on shipping to Europe. As long as you had the guts, any Liberty ship loaded with goods could return from the UK, Europe, or Asia with wealth dozens or even hundreds of times greater than before. If you're going to risk your life, isn't that better than fighting over territory in the US? So, during the years of World War II, most of the American mafia was busy engaging in foreign trade. Of course, this wasn't everyone, but those left behind were either too small to matter or were dealing with issues that didn't involve ordinary people. In conclusion, due to all these factors, white neighborhoods during the war tended to be much safer than before the conflict. Back at home, Josh locked the door and sat down in a chair. System. Connect me to Daenerys. With these words, a virtual screen appeared in front of Josh. This screen was part of the system, the Dimensional Trading System, and it was Josh's crucial survival tool in this era, a golden cheat from a mysterious high-dimensional civilization. The system's function was simple. It had a dimensional beacon that could randomly be sent to an unknown world, where it would select a host. Then Josh could conduct transactions with that host. Additionally, every year, the system would generate a new beacon, seeking out new worlds. Apart from that, the system also had a powerful inventory function. The reason the guns in the car had disappeared earlier was that Josh had used the inventory. The first world the system had connected to was from a TV show Josh had watched in his previous life, Game of Thrones. And the host wasn't just anyone, it was none other than the famous Daenerys Targaryen, the Mother of Dragons. The 10 ounces of gold Josh had sold earlier were from his first trade with Daenerys. The items he had traded were a .38 revolver left by his former father and a copy of The Prince. Now, the M1917 rifles Josh had prepared were also intended to trade with Daenerys for more gold or silver. "Josh, did you get the goods?" The once dim screen lit up, and there appeared Daenerys, simply dressed but looking as beautiful and radiant as ever, her silver hair shining brightly. The time when the dimensional beacon had connected to Daenerys was during the 6th season of Game of Thrones, right after she had killed the Dothraki leaders with fire and gained the loyalty of the Dothraki tribes, preparing to return to Slavers Bay to crush the rebellion. By the time she would reconquer Slavers Bay, she would lead an army of Unsullied, Dothraki, and 3 grown dragons across the sea to launch an assault on Westeros. Of course, look at this rifle, its power and range are many times greater than a handgun. Josh waved his hand, and an M1917 rifle appeared from the system's storage. He then started explaining how to use the bolt-action rifle. A live demonstration, however, was out of the question. Firing a gun would definitely attract the police. Great, same price as before. Daenerys was already familiar with guns after trying the revolver, understanding that anyone, even a weak person, could easily kill a trained soldier with such a weapon. It was far superior to a crossbow. That's not going to work. Handguns are small and cheap, but rifles are different. Their power is much greater. Trust me, Daenerys, no armor or shield in your world can withstand a shot from this rifle within its range, Josh said, shaking his head, not trying to deceive her. Even though the M1917 had been largely retired from the US military and was mostly used for training, it was still highly regarded in many countries as a great rifle. A few years later, large numbers of these rifles would still be used by Chinese soldiers in the Korean War, where they taught the seemingly invincible US Army a tough lesson. I want to remove these type of sentences, but then it doesn't feel like a Chinese FIC. The M1917 had high muzzle velocity, strong bullet energy, excellent range, flat trajectory, and great accuracy, far superior to the famous Japanese Arisaka Type 38 rifle. Furthermore, in both world wars, most nations used high-powered full-caliber rounds, which had incredible penetration. Although A Song of Ice and Fire was a fantasy world, apart from the long-lost Valyria, the metallurgy of most human kingdoms wasn't advanced. The low-purity gold she had traded earlier was proof of that. So Josh was sure that no armor or shield in Westeros could withstand a shot from this rifle. "Oh, so what's your price?" Daenerys's interest was piqued by Josh's confidence. While the revolver had already impressed her, she knew that the 38's power was limited. It might punch through leather armor at close range, but steel armor was another matter. 3 times the price. Josh went all in. And, don't think it's too expensive. The revolver only came with 50 rounds of ammo, but I'll include 100 rounds for each rifle. Josh had bought 1,000 rounds, but he planned to provide only 100. The rest he would sell separately. After all, this was a monopoly business, and he wasn't worried about Daenerys not buying. Without bullets, the guns were nothing but fancy sticks. If the rifle's power is as you say, then the price is fair, Daenerys nodded. Gold wouldn't be an issue once she returned to Slavers Bay. The slave masters had accumulated massive amounts of wealth. If the rifles were as powerful as Josh claimed, and if her Unsullied and Dothraki armies were armed with these wonder weapons, along with her fully grown dragons, who in Westeros could possibly stop her? Chapter 4. In need of help with a ding. Josh and Daenerys completed their trade. Daenerys now had 4 rifles and 400 rounds of ammunition in her stockpile, while Josh received 120 ounces of gold. Unlike their previous trade, which included some gold jewelry, this time the gold was in the form of 12 neatly melted bars of gold. It was clear that Daenerys had prepared a large amount of gold in advance for this transaction. Despite the differences between their two worlds, such as language, script and measurement systems, system automatically translated and converted everything, making it quite convenient. Seeing such a large amount of gold at once, Josh couldn't help but feel a little excited. It was 3.4 kilograms of gold, which would be worth over 1,000,000 yuan at the price of gold before his time travel. TN. USD equivalent approximately 10,000. Although Josh's financial situation in his previous life hadn't been bad, apart from the property he owned, he'd never seen so much cash before. He had seen more gold, but only in jewelry shops. Resisting the urge to take the gold out and play with it, Josh prepared to close the system. He had to think carefully about how to liquidate such a large amount of gold. Although his last gold sale had gone smoothly and the shopkeeper, Old Hawk, seemed trustworthy, this time the amount of gold had increased 12-fold and things might not go so smoothly. "Wait, Josh," Daenerys called just as Josh was about to log off. "Is there something else?" Josh asked, a little surprised. After all, Daenerys was on her way back to Slaver's Bay with the Dothraki army to put down a rebellion, and she was pretty busy. "I really liked that book The Prince you traded me earlier. The description of what qualities a ruler should possess was particularly enlightening. If I had read this book a few years earlier, Slaver's Bay might not be as chaotic as it is now. However, the book is limited in content. For example, it doesn't give detailed records of the rulers it mentions. I'm very interested in their experiences. Could you help me find more books like this?" Daenerys asked, holding up the copy of The Prince that Josh had traded her. As a princess in exile, Daenerys had spent her childhood constantly on the run, with few days of peace. As a result, she never received any formal training in ruling, and even her basic education was incomplete. This didn't seem to matter much when her forces were small. But as her army grew, her shortcomings became more apparent. How to mediate between the different factions and social classes in her territories, how to manage her subordinates, how to govern her lands, and what kind of ruler she should strive to be. These were all things she had to learn. It was also one of the main reasons why she was still stuck in Slaver's Bay. Her lack of experience as a ruler meant that the cities of Slaver's Bay were constantly in rebellion. Not only did she fail to build up her forces, but she also lost resources and influence, while some of her most important advisors, such as Tyrion, who had recently joined her, helped to advise her on what kind of ruler she should be. Their advice was based on their own expectations of what they wanted her to be, rather than helping her to become the ruler she wanted to be. In the past, Daenerys hadn't seen through this and simply believed she wasn't good enough, which led her to constantly compromise. But the prince, though brief, hit the nail on the head and allowed her to see things more clearly. Daenerys was a quick learner, and her ability to reach her current position showed that she had a sharp mind. It was only her limited perspective that held her back. Now that she had access to the interdimensional knowledge through Josh, a whole new world of knowledge had opened up to her. Naturally, this aroused her interest in the literature and history of Josh's world. "Of course I can help, but it will take some time. There are many books on the subject," Josh agreed without hesitation. As Daenerys was his only trading partner at the moment, her rapid growth would be beneficial to him. The sooner Daenerys matured and became a competent ruler, the more likely she would avoid the mistakes of the original story, where she met a tragic end. Only then could Josh maintain his trade with her. If Daenerys were to die, the interdimensional beacon would randomly select a new host. If the new host turned out to be another lord or noble, that would be fine, but if it was someone like a beggar or a person with nothing to their name, things would get tricky. Josh would then have to spend time and effort helping them build up enough resources to trade with him. Finding someone as powerful and wealthy as Daenerys as his first trading partner had been a stroke of luck for Josh. There was no guarantee that the new beacon to be generated next year would bring him such luck again. So aside from trading with Daenerys for profit, Josh was happy to help her in other ways. In fact, if he hadn't been worried about overwhelming her, he would have told her the whole Game of Thrones plot by now. "That's wonderful. Thank you so much. I had originally planned to go to Westeros as soon as I got back to Slaver's Bay. But now I think I'll take some time to learn more and gather some extra strength. Besides, if possible, I'd like to equip the entire Unsullied army with these rifles," Daenerys said. "That might be difficult in the short term. I'm not like you, after all. I'm still a small figure in my world. Buying dozens or even hundreds of guns is one thing, but 8,000. That's a much bigger challenge," Josh replied helplessly. Although the US didn't ban guns, Buying 8,000 rifles at once would require going through arms dealers, which would inevitably expose Josh. As a 15-year-old with considerable wealth but no power to back it up, he'd quickly become a target. In the end, Josh's real problem was that he was all alone, without any trustworthy help. But finding reliable allies wasn't easy, especially for someone in Josh's position. Josh's full name was Josh Kahn, and he was of Austrian descent, which in a way made him a citizen of the infamous dictator. 5 years ago, when the dictator annexed Austria, Josh's parents fled the country, eventually immigrating to the United States. The Kahn family had some wealth in Austria, but they sold most of it at a loss during their escape. By the time they arrived in America and bought a small apartment, they were nearly penniless. Josh's father supported the family with a job on the docks. Although they had been in the US for 5 years, the family had been slow to integrate, as only Josh's father spoke fluent English. Josh had gone to school in the US for a few years, but apart from improving his English, he hadn't learned much. He also hadn't made any friends because of his introverted nature. Things got worse 3 months ago when his parents died of food poisoning from improperly cured sausage while Josh wasn't home. Their deaths were sudden and unexpected. For a 15-year-old boy, it was a huge blow. Without the help of a local priest, Josh wouldn't even have known how to pay for his parents' funeral, which used up almost all the money they had left. Since then, Josh had stopped attending school and drifted aimlessly for 3 months before his current self took over. With such limited social connections, Josh couldn't find any trustworthy friends or family to rely on. Understanding Josh's explanation, Daenerys nodded in sympathy, having experienced similar hardships herself. "Well, if you need reliable help, how about I send you some Unsullied?" Daenerys suggested after a moment's thought. Unsullied. Josh was tempted by the idea. Chapter 5. The car is gone. Indeed, when it comes to reliability and loyalty, who can compare to the Unsullied soldiers? Daenerys said. The dimensional trading system can trade living creatures, but trading living creatures is a little more complicated than normal transactions. The traded subject must not resist or have the ability to resist. However, this is apparently not an issue when it comes to the Unsullied. The Unsullied are an army created by slave masters in Slavers' Bay who, after castrating their slaves at a young age, subjected them to brainwashing with no freedom, status or emotions, leaving them with only endless obedience. Before Daenerys arrived at Slavers' Bay, these soldiers had erased almost all traces of their humanity, including their bodies, emotions and feelings of pain, leaving only their absolute obedience to their master and their fearlessness of death and torture. It was only after Daenerys tricked the slave masters into giving her the authority to command them that she granted them freedom and dignity. And so this fearless army pledged its allegiance to Daenerys. So as long as Daenerys spoke to them and offered them to Josh as bargaining chips, they would not resist. I must say that Josh was quite tempted by Daenerys' proposal. The Unsullied soldiers might not be intellectually competent because of their slave status, but they would be perfect guards. If he had dozens of Unsullied soldiers and taught them how to use weapons, he wouldn't have to fear the CPD, Chicago Police Department, or the gangs. He wouldn't have to be so careful about exchanging gold. As for whether having a few more people around would cause unnecessary trouble, he didn't have to worry too much about that. After all, the whole world was at war, and major U.S. port cities like Chicago, Los Angeles and New York were full of refugees who had been given visas and forced to live in designated refugee camps. Although Chicago was supposed to be an inland area, its port could be connected to Europe via the Lawrence River. This was one of the main reasons why Chicago had so many immigrants from Italy and other parts of Europe. So as long as Josh spent a little more money, he could easily give the Unsullied refugee status and thus legally obtain U.S. citizenship. However, after careful consideration, Josh ultimately rejected Daenerys' proposal. Sorry, Daenerys, your suggestion is great, but I hope you understand the importance of the trading system to us. I still don't think it's appropriate for anyone but us to know of its existence because it puts us at risk, even if that risk is minimal, Josh said, shaking his head. You're right, I was a bit hasty, Daenerys replied after considering Josh's words and saying nothing further. After disconnecting from Daenerys, Josh let out a sigh of relief. With a wave of his hand, a heavy bar of gold appeared in his palm. Ooh, looking at the gold bar, Josh couldn't help but kiss it. Gold is just a wonderful thing. After enjoying the gold for a moment, Josh got up to tidy up his things. Seeing that it wasn't too late outside, he prepared to go out for dinner. There was still some bread at home, but he'd been gnawing on it for almost a week, and he wasn't about to eat it again anytime soon. Most of the dollars he'd exchanged in the morning had been spent, but there were still a few dozen dollars left, so he didn't need to deprive himself. Josh straightened his clothes, checked the M1911 he had bought during the day, loaded it and placed it in the system's storage before casually stepping out. Mr. Khan. Just as he was heading down the stairs, he was stopped by someone in uniform. Josh recognized the uniform as the one that belonged to the property management company. "Is there something you need?" Josh asked, a little confused. "Mr. Khan, this is your property management bill for the last 3 months. We didn't bother you earlier because of the death of your parents, but it's been quite a while now, don't you think?" It turned out that the person was there to collect a debt, but their attitude was quite nice. What surprised Josh was that property management fees existed in America at this time. Of course, this was only due to Josh's limited knowledge. In fact, the concept of property management fees had emerged in Britain as early as the 1860s and soon spread to the US. Although it was the 1940s, the American system was already well established. Although Josh was a little surprised, he accepted the bill. Fortunately, the land charge wasn't expensive. After all, it was an ordinary apartment building, with a monthly fee of 42 cents, or just over $1 for 3 months. He immediately took out the money. Seeing Josh pull out the money, the other party smiled slightly with relief. Property management companies weren't afraid of homeowners not being able to pay the management fees, because in Europe and the US, property management companies were very powerful. If a homeowner accumulated a certain amount of debt, they could go to court and auction off the homeowner's house. Just before Josh crossed over, he had seen a news story about a Chinese-American doctoral student who had a dispute with a property management company that maliciously refused to pay her fees. As a result, her multi-million-dollar house was auctioned off at a low price, and when the police arrived to serve the judgment, she resisted violently and ended up being shot. But while the property management companies weren't afraid, that didn't mean the people collecting the fees weren't scared. Failure to collect or complaints from homeowners would affect their bonuses, so it was better for them to avoid trouble. By the way, does your property management company handle property sales? After paying, Josh casually tipped the person 10 cents and then asked, Mr. Khan, are you planning on moving?" The person asked in surprise after hearing Josh's question. "Yes, that's right. This place is my place of sorrow, you understand, so I'm planning to leave here." Josh feigned sadness. But the truth was that he had no intention of continuing to live here. After all, this flat was too small, there was a general safety factor, and someone had died here. Even though it was the parents of this body, Josh still felt uncomfortable about it. Previously, he had no money and no choice. Now, if he sold all the gold in the system warehouse, he wouldn't be able to buy an extravagant mansion, but he could easily buy a large 6-bedroom house in a high-end community. Of course, that didn't mean Josh had to buy such a big house, as he was all alone and didn't need it. He also needed to keep most of the money as working capital. So, in the short term, he only planned to rent a slightly more upscale apartment. "I see. The company does indeed handle property sales, and small units like this one are quite easy to sell. If Mr. Khan needs assistance, I can help you make contact," the person nodded and said. "Then I won't bother you anymore and please let me know if there's any news," Josh nodded, not specifying how to contact him, as it wasn't necessary. Although the flat was quite ordinary, there was a doorman at the entrance so they could see when he was at home. After negotiating with the person, Josh left the apartment. However, his initially pleasant mood immediately turned sour. Where his newly bought second-hand Ford was supposed to be parked, there was nothing but emptiness. Chapter 6. Little Italy. On the streets of Chicago in the evening, Josh stood in the wind and felt disheveled. It had only been a few hours since he had returned home and his newly purchased car had already been stolen. It was an experience he had never had before. In his previous life, living in the safest country, he had never encountered such a situation and had hardly even heard of it. Lol the brainwashing, but America was different. In New York City alone, from January to March 2022, the number of stolen cars exceeded 2,000. If this was the case in 2022, Imagine how rampant car theft must have been in the early 1940s. It was no surprise, then, that Josh, unprepared after buying a car, fell victim to such a situation. So what did he do when he discovered that his car had been stolen? Call the police. Josh shook his head as he looked at the patrolman in the distance. Come on, the arrest rate for car theft in America, even 60 years later, is not high, let alone in this time. Moreover, the corruption of the American police force was very high at that time. Without money or power, you couldn't expect them to do anything. Finally, there was a very important problem. The car Josh had bought at lunchtime had not even been registered yet. So, even though Josh felt frustrated, he could only accept his bad luck. No car. Then he would just walk. Josh had originally planned to drive around to see what fun places Chicago had to offer at night, but now he could only grab a quick bite nearby and go back to sleep. Without a car, there was no way he was going to wander around in the American night of this era, even with a gun. Before long, the time had moved to the next day. After packing, he went out again, not on foot but by pre-ordering a taxi, and returned to the grocery store from yesterday. On entering, he found that it was not Old Hawk standing behind the counter, but a young girl of about 20. Good morning. What can I help you with? The young girl asked warmly when she saw Josh. Is Old Hawk not here? Josh replied with a question instead of stating his purpose. After all, Old Hawk was the owner of the store. It was unlikely that this girl could make decisions about buying gold. Are you looking for my grandfather? Wait a minute, he's working in the back, I'll go get him. The girl didn't mind Josh's attitude and turned to go to the back of the shop. She was Old Hawk's granddaughter and often helped out. She had seen her share of mysterious customers like Josh and was unfazed. Soon Old Hawk came out and was quite surprised to see Josh again. Good to see you again, young man. Back for more gold? Yes, your prices are quite reasonable, so I decided to exchange some more. I just don't know if you can handle it, Josh nodded. Ha ha, young man, I know what you're worried about, but don't underestimate Old Hawk. This shop has been here for decades. It may look small, but it contains many valuable items. See that, even though they're all secondhand, even the amount of gold you exchanged yesterday wouldn't be enough to trade for any of the watches in this cabinet, Old Hawk said, pointing with a smile to a nearby display case. If Old Hawk hadn't mentioned it, Josh wouldn't have noticed. However, after taking a closer look at the case, he realized that Old Hawk was not exaggerating. There were not many watches in the case, only 7 or 8, but each one was in excellent condition. Although he didn't know much about watches, having never been able to afford high-end watches in his previous life, he recognized the brands. Patek Philippe, Rolex, Breguet. Although it was the 1940s, each of these famous watches would be worth at least $1,000 today, assuming they were genuine, of course. Even if only half of them were authentic, their value would exceed the gold in Josh's possession. He could only regret his lack of experience. 120 ounces, the purity should be about right. With Old Hawk so confident, Josh hesitated no longer. As he had done yesterday, he pulled out a small pouch and placed it on the counter. 12 gold bars weighing over 3.4 kilograms sounded like a lot. But in terms of volume, it wasn't much at all. After all, the density of gold was what it was. Each bar weighed 10 ounces, not much bigger than a Snickers bar. So even though Josh had taken it out of the system, it didn't raise any suspicion. Nice stuff, I'll take it all at yesterday's price, how about that? Old Hawk picked up a gold bar, weighed it and smiled. Sure, the price offered was indeed quite fair, and Josh naturally had no objections. In no time the 120 ounces of gold were exchanged for $4,800. Receiving the money, Josh felt a surge of excitement. After stuffing the thick stack of bills into his pocket, actually, directly into the system's inventory, Josh said goodbye to Old Hawk and walked out of the shop. Turning 2 corners and making sure no one was watching or following him, he planned to hail a cab to take him to a car dealership to buy another car. After all, Chicago, the 3rd largest city in America, was quite expansive. The public transport system in America was also very poor. It was quite inconvenient without a car. As for car theft, Josh had already thought of a solution. He would always park in deserted areas and then store the car directly in the system's warehouse. How could it be stolen then? But calling a taxi was not so easy. Yesterday he had been lucky and found one immediately, but today he waited for more than 10 minutes without seeing a single free taxi. Just as he was getting impatient, a Ford drove past. Although cars of this era all looked somewhat similar, Josh immediately recognized it as the car he had bought yesterday and which had now been stolen. There was a very noticeable scratch on the back of this car when he bought it, just like the one in front of him. His mind racing, he immediately took off after it. Although the speed of cars at that time was already over 70 miles per hour, because they were in the city and during wartime, Roosevelt had ordered a ban on high-speed driving. Even on highways the maximum speed could not exceed 35 miles per hour. So the speed of the other car was not fast, just over 20 miles per hour. Driven by youth and frustration, Josh managed to keep up for a while. But when the car turned at an intersection ahead, Josh stopped. There was no safe place ahead, it was the immigrant district, Little Italy. 2 streets further on was Chinatown. Unfortunately, unlike the famous tourist attractions and bustling markets in later years, the Little Italy and Chinatown of this era were synonymous with slums, not much better than the segregated black neighborhoods. From the original body's memories, his parents had often warned him not to get too close to Little Italy and Chinatown, so Josh was now quite reluctant. Chapter 7. Car thieves. Influenced by various mafia films such as The Godfather and legendary figures such as Al Capone and the Five Families, it's easy to develop the illusion that Italians have it easy in America. But the reality is quite the opposite. For a long period in American history, the least favored white ethnic group was not the Irish, as many might assume, but the Italians. In almost every mafia film, the mafia boss is typically portrayed as Italian, which in itself is a form of discrimination. Moreover, in the film Green Book, the police refer to the Italian-American protagonist as half a Negro, which illustrates the awkward situation of Italians in America at the time. Being called half a Negro by Anglo-Saxon Americans became a derogatory term that followed Italians from the 19th century to the mid-20th century. So why did immigrants from Italy, once a cultural center of Europe, find themselves in such a predicament? The reason is simple. Most Italian immigrants to America came from southern Italy. Just as the U.S. is divided into North and South, Italy has a similar division. Northern Italy is economically developed and relatively wealthy, while the South is mountainous, resource-poor and generally poorer. Wealthy Italians from the North rarely chose to immigrate to the United States, opting instead for South America. As the Italian wave of immigration came later than that of other European countries, the distribution of resources among different ethnic groups in America was already established. For example, wealthy Italians preferred to go to South America because of the greater opportunities there, employing natives and blacks as laborers while taking on managerial roles. Poor Italians, on the other hand, lacked capital and chose to go to the more prosperous North America to work for already established Americans. This meant that Italians arriving in the U.S. were primarily uneducated, impoverished individuals. In addition, as Southern Europeans, Italians have closer blood ties to Latin groups, which makes their physical appearance markedly different. Combined with traits such as a preference for communal living, working class status and low levels of education, these characteristics easily led to negative associations. As a result, Italians in America were long relegated to the lowest paid jobs and denied access to the upper echelons of society. The Chinese in neighboring Chinatown faced similar problems. In particular, during President Coolidge's administration, a special immigration law was passed in 1924 targeting Italians. This law may have been little known, but its impact on Italian immigrants was comparable to that of the Chinese Exclusion Act. Naturally, this caused considerable resentment among many Italian Americans. What to do about it? The obvious answer was to turn to organized crime. The existing Italian mafia simply moved its operations to America, and the results were surprisingly effective. In addition to facing discrimination, Italians now acquired a reputation as gangsters, which both intimidated and further alienated them. Under the influence of this notorious reputation, Josh naturally felt a sense of fear as he approached the Little Italy neighborhood. Nevertheless, after much hesitation, Josh decided to enter. After all, his car had been stolen just hours after he bought it, and he had never experienced such humiliation in his life. Before entering Little Italy, however, Josh adjusted his collar to cover his face and went into a gun shop across the street. Gun shops are plentiful and sometimes quite convenient. To enter the notorious Italian district, Josh felt that an M1911 wouldn't be enough. He needed at least 2 Thompsons and a shotgun. Although he was a time traveler and had never been in the military, Josh knew how to use weapons. In his previous life, while traveling in Russia, he had practiced on shooting ranges and had even hunted in the Far East, spending a considerable amount of money doing so. Furthermore, even in his past life, Josh had gone hunting with his father before he died, although he had only used a rifle. So while he wasn't an expert with firearms, he could at least handle them. Josh soon settled on a Thompson, the mob's favorite, along with an M1918 Browning automatic rifle, a shotgun and ammunition. He spent almost $200. After buying the weapons, he ducked into an empty alley, assembled the firearms and stored them in the system's warehouse. Once that was done, Josh calmly walked into Little Italy. Perhaps because it was daytime, the streets of Little Italy seemed a little dirty and disorganized, with a smell of sewage, but there weren't many idle thugs around. It was a far cry from the notorious neighborhoods of later generations. Although many Italians were involved in organized crime, as in Chinatown, the majority of the hard-working lower-class residents were busy making a living during the day. It was only at night that the area tended to become chaotic. Josh's preparations were therefore unnecessary, but after checking 2 streets, Josh couldn't find the car and was a little discouraged when he realized that the thief had only passed through Little Italy. Just as he was about to give up, he suddenly spotted the back of a car poking out of the entrance of an old warehouse. Josh glanced around to make sure no one was watching before he headed towards the warehouse. As he got closer, he could see the entire back of the car, complete with the distinctive scratch. It was then that he heard voices coming from inside the old warehouse. "Listen, Joe, this is just an old Ford from over a decade ago. Even on the second-hand market it would sell for 200, tops. I still have to deal with the joints, so the best I can offer you is 50. If that doesn't satisfy you, find someone else," said a gruff voice with a thick Italian accent. "Don't be like that, Mike. You know how hard it is to find work these days. Come on, add $10, just $10. How about it?" said another smooth-sounding voice. As Josh cautiously approached the warehouse, he could easily make out the situation inside. There were 2 men. One was a middle-aged man with a Mediterranean hairstyle covered in oil stains, and the other was a slightly overweight, short young man. From their conversation it was easy to deduce that the young man was the car thief, while the middle-aged man specialized in selling stolen cars. The various car parts scattered around the warehouse confirmed that this was a hub for the stolen car trade. As well as his old Ford, there was another car parked inside. Josh's attention was soon drawn to this other vehicle. It was a famous Cadillac V16. Chapter 8. Stealing from the Mafia. The Cadillac V16 was introduced in 1930 and discontinued in 1940. It was one of the top luxury cars before the Second World War, and is known as the world's first mass-produced car with a 16-cylinder engine. It was a custom-made car with low production numbers, selling only about 4,000 units over 11 years, with an average price of $8,000. Yesterday, when Josh was shopping for a car, he also had a look at one at a used car dealership. The dealership is one of the largest in Chicago. At that time, the seller quoted a price of $9,000, which was double Josh's entire net worth. The high price made Josh back down. In fact, although they were both used cars, the others were depreciating, whereas this particular car had actually increased in value. Also, the one in the garage was a silver-gray convertible, full of artistic flair. By comparison, Josh's own car, a 1934 Ford 730 Deluxe, was essentially industrial junk. Josh immediately fell in love with this powerful luxury vehicle. He had never expected a shady underground car dealer to get his hands on such a car. The fact that it was custom-built meant that the owner of the Cadillac V16 had to be either very rich or very powerful. After all, the hefty price tag of $8,000 is not something an ordinary wealthy person could afford. So, in theory, someone who could own such a car is definitely not someone an ordinary car thief gang would dare to mess with. So the appearance of this car in a place like this seemed rather out of place. But Josh didn't care. Since he saw it here, it was his. But instead of going straight out, Josh first took off his coat and changed into a leather jacket from his system warehouse, then put on a hood. Only God knows when he had prepared that. After getting ready, Josh pulled out the Thompson he had just bought and went out. "Who are you?" Oh, sir, we can talk this out." Upon hearing the noise, the two men inside the warehouse immediately looked over with caution and shouted. But when they saw the Thompson in Josh's hand, they immediately raised their hands and softened their tone. Josh was pleased with their attitude. "Look at that. These Italians aren't so bad, are they? It's nothing like the movies. Don't worry, I just need a car. Where are the keys?" Josh asked the middle-aged Mediterranean man through his mask, his voice deep. "Oh no sir, you can't take this car, it belongs to Mr. Scappa. If you take it, he won't spare us." The middle-aged man panicked when he saw that Josh wanted the keys to the Cadillac V16. Scappa, who is that? Josh couldn't help but be curious about the Mediterranean's attitude. "Mr. Scappa is a high-ranking member of the Moretti family who runs all the red light district business in East Chicago," the Mediterranean replied. "This is his car. It's only parked here temporarily, and someone will come to pick it up in the afternoon. If you drive it away, none of us will survive." "The Moretti family, who are they?" Josh asked. "Sir, you just arrived in Chicago, right?" The slightly chubby young man beside him spoke up. "What about it? What's it to you?" Josh retorted, as he indeed had just arrived in Chicago. "The Moretti family is one of the biggest crime families in Chicago. If you've been in Chicago for a while, you can't possibly not know that name. My friend, let me advise you, if you want to survive in Chicago, it's best not to offend them," the young man said with a smile. "Oh, sounds powerful. Why don't you tell me about the major forces in Chicago? Besides Al Capone, I really don't know anyone else," Josh replied thoughtfully. "Ha ha, Mr. Capone certainly deserves our respect, but that was over a decade ago. Now Chicago is run by the Moretti family, the Clementi family and the Vinci family. Oh, and maybe we should throw in the triads," the young man explained to Josh about the power dynamics in Chicago. Although Josh hadn't planned on getting involved in the underworld, he found it quite interesting. The young man's eloquence made Josh feel like he was listening to a fascinating story. "I didn't expect you, a car thief, to be so well informed. What's your name?" Josh asked after the young man had finished. "My name is Joe Barbaro. You can call me Joe, sir." "This is Mike, sir. Now that we've met, we're friends. Of course, we can't let you leave empty-handed. As long as you don't touch this car, you can take whatever you want from the stuff in this warehouse. Oh, and there should be quite a bit of money in Mike's safe, you can take that too." Joe's chubby face smiled like a wilting chrysanthemum in front of the Thompson. "You're a perceptive guy, but unfortunately, I only want this car. I'll say it again. Hand over the keys." Josh shifted his tone, clearly not taking the warning seriously. Josh's words instantly made Joe and Mike's faces drop, realizing that after all the talk, this guy didn't take them seriously at all. "Sir," Joe tried to say something. "Shut up. Either give me the keys or die right here. Don't think I'm easy to fool. The fact that this car is here means that you either belong to the Moretti family or work for them. Even if I don't take the car and take something else, do you think you'll just let it go afterwards?" Josh scoffed. "So what if it's the mafia? I'm robbing the mafia. It's not a good idea to get involved with the mafia." But the conflict had already begun when they stole his car. Taking this Cadillac was more than just making it easier for these two to explain. It held no significant meaning otherwise. Besides, Josh wanted to get back at this thief called Joe. How could he let him off so easily? In fact, if he didn't want to attract the police, Josh almost considered taking them both out right then and there. So Josh really didn't care about offending the mafia. More importantly, since entering the Italian district, he had half covered his face with a coat, and now he was wearing a hood. With the tracking and surveillance technology of the day, as long as he didn't show his face, no one would find him. Faced with the threat of a gun, Mike, though extremely reluctant, slowly pulled the keys from his pocket. "And get me the keys to that car and the safe, and tell me the code," Josh pointed to his old Ford. "You'll regret this." Facing the gun, Mike still complied, but he didn't forget to threaten. "Whether I regret it or not, I don't know, but if you say one more word, I'll make sure you don't even get a chance to regret it," Josh sneered. "Now, you two get in the car." After getting the keys, Josh opened the door to the Ford. Once the two had obediently got in, Josh closed and locked the door. Car door locks in this era were basically the same as house locks. They could be locked from the inside or the outside. If someone locked inside didn't have a key, they could only get out by breaking a window. However, if they dared to break a window, even though Josh had never killed anyone, he wouldn't mind shooting them. After locking them inside, Josh maliciously poured a jug of coffee into the Ford's fuel tank while they watched. Having done all that, Josh began to search the warehouse. His main targets were the desk and the safe. When he opened the safe, there wasn't much money inside, just a few $100s. However, there were quite a few ration coupons. There were coupons for petrol, sweets, alcohol and coffee, all regulated materials. The quantities weren't large, but there was enough for 4 or 5 people. At this particular time, these items were far more valuable than money. Josh tucked the ration coupons into his bag. He then searched the desk and found nothing of value, but he did come across an M1911, the same model as the one he had bought earlier. On the principle of making the most of every opportunity, Josh tucked it away. Then Josh collected several tires stored in the warehouse that the two men couldn't see from inside the car and stored them in his system warehouse. In this era, practical synthetic rubber was primarily produced by just 2 companies, while American tires were still made entirely from natural rubber. Moreover, with the major rubber-producing regions of Southeast Asia blocked by the Japanese, the U.S. had only South America as a source of rubber, making tires an even more critical strategic resource than petrol during the war. Finally, after a thorough looting, Josh left the warehouse, driving the Cadillac away under the angry gaze of the 2 Italians in the Ford. Chapter 9. Hitchhiking. As Josh drove the car out of the warehouse and onto the road, he removed the hood. Although it was a convertible, he had already raised the top before he left, so by simply pulling up his collar it was impossible for anyone outside to see his face clearly. Also, Josh didn't drive the car straight home. A Cadillac V16 in this era was too conspicuous. If Josh drove it home, it would be like telling the mafia that he had stolen it. So Josh drove the car out of town instead. Then, not far out of town, he found a deserted wooded area, parked the car, and took a set of clothes he hadn't worn from the system warehouse to change into. Then he set fire to his original clothes. Perfect. Let the mafia look for him. Let them turn Chicago upside down and see if they can find him. The only problem was that without the Cadillac he had no means of transport. Now he was several kilometers out of town, which was neither too much nor too little. Josh didn't want to walk back. So, after leaving the woods, he walked to the side of the road and prepared to hitch a ride. The hitchhiking culture in America had started in the 1920s when cars became popular, so it wasn't new. There were risks, of course, but this was the outskirts of Chicago, where those who specialized in highway robbery didn't usually operate. Even if he ran into trouble, Josh had plenty of weapons in his system warehouse, so he wasn't worried. However, not every driver was willing to pick up hitchhikers. The first few cars completely ignored Josh's attempts to flag them down. Fortunately, his luck wasn't that bad. After about 10 minutes, a car that had just passed him suddenly slowed down and stopped. Josh ran a few steps to catch up. It was a very nice convertible, similar to Josh's Cadillac V16 of course. Like Josh's previous car, this one also had the top raised as well, as the weather was still quite cold. If the top was down, it would be enough to freeze a person to death. The car's bonnet ornament, a flying lady, revealed its identity. It was a Packard. Few people in the 21st century have heard of this name, as the brand had ended its history in 1958. But in America from the 1920s to the 1940s, Packard was as famous as Cadillac as a luxury car brand. This brand had several emblems, with the Flying Lady, Swan and Crystal Lady being the 3 main types, of which the Flying Lady was the most common and represented its heyday. The Packard 8, for example, was a very classic model. Although its price couldn't compete with the Cadillac V16, it still cost over $2,000, placing it firmly in the luxury car category. However, when Josh got a good look at the driver in the car, he found the car beautiful, but the person in it even more so. Yes, the driver was a woman, an exceptionally beautiful young woman. With her snow-white delicate skin, bright red lips, exquisite features and a head of golden curls characteristic of the era, all complemented by a smooth fur coat. She was truly a modern American beauty. "Hello there, handsome boy. Are you in some kind of trouble?" the woman in the driver's seat asked Josh with a smile. She had intended to ignore Josh, but a casual glance at his good looks made her stop the car. There was no denying it, despite his youthful appearance, Josh's looks and physique were indeed striking. With his typical German features, golden brown hair and pale blue eyes, along with his delicate features and lack of freckles, he was quite impressive. Although not yet 16, he stood nearly 6 feet tall and had a very upright posture. The only flaw was that he lacked a certain amount of diet and exercise, which made him appear a bit lean. However, this gave him a touch of graceful charm. Of course, this charm was similar to that of an older brother. Not the kind of charm one would associate with a feminine stereotype. So, whatever the era, good looks are always a plus. This stunning young woman must have noticed Josh's handsome face, otherwise she wouldn't have stopped her car all alone in such a place. "Good afternoon, pretty lady. I apologize for the intrusion, but my friends played a prank on me and left me in this desolate area. I hope you can give me a lift," Josh asked politely. "Oh, poor child, your friends aren't very nice. Come on, hop in, darling, we can't have you freezing out here." The woman invited him warmly into the car after hearing his words. "What's your name?" the beautiful woman asked as she started the car after Josh got in. Josh Khan. "And what do I call you, ma'am?" Josh replied, noting the large diamond ring on her left hand. It was quite striking. Diamonds weren't as inflated in value at that time as they would be in later years, but they weren't cheap either. The ring must have been at least 10 carats, what today would be called a pigeon egg, and probably worth over $1 million 60 years later. Even if the marketing of diamonds was just beginning, such a ring would still be worth close to $10,000. Wow, this woman was a big spender. Of course, the diamond could be a fake. But with the way she was dressed in the luxurious Packard, the chances were slim. "Margaret Windus," she smiled. "Hello, Mrs. Windus. You really are a kind and beautiful angel. Without you, I would probably have had to walk several miles home on an empty stomach," Josh complimented. "Oh, Josh, you sure know how to flatter." Hearing his praise, Margaret seemed quite pleased. "Ma'am, I'm not flattering you, I'm being completely honest," Josh replied earnestly. "You are the most beautiful woman I have ever seen." Well, he wasn't lying. At least in this life after his rebirth, Mrs. Windus was the most beautiful woman he had ever met, far surpassing Daenerys. Especially the mature woman's charm, which the petite mother of dragons simply didn't possess. And for some reason, Josh felt this woman looked familiar. Was she a celebrity? Perhaps. But his knowledge of celebrities from that era was limited, so he couldn't remember. "Come on, you should save those compliments for the young girls. It would work on them, but not on me," she said dismissively, although her smile suggested she liked it. "Madam, are you a film star? I don't think these Hollywood actresses have your charm," Josh asked cautiously. "Is that a compliment? But I'm afraid I'm going to have to disappoint you. I'm just an ordinary housewife," Margaret replied with a smile and a shake of her head. "An ordinary housewife. I'll believe that when pigs fly," Josh thought as he looked at the luxurious car and the massive diamond, rolling his eyes inwardly. Chapter 10. Turkish cuisine. The car, driven by Margaret, quickly returned to downtown Chicago. On the way, thanks to Josh's deliberate compliments and his experience as a time traveler, Margaret and he had a pleasant conversation. As a result, Josh gained a certain amount of trust from the beautiful woman and learned about her family situation through their conversations. As Margaret had said earlier, she wasn't a celebrity but a housewife. But this housewife was not as ordinary as Josh had imagined. Her husband was a tennis star, often busy with matches all over the country and rarely at home. But that wasn't the point. The main point was Margaret herself. Her father was a prominent jeweler and property developer in Chicago, and she was his only daughter. When her father died 2 years ago, all his wealth naturally passed to her. So whether it was the luxury car, the diamond ring or other lavish items, they were all bought with her own money. In contrast, although her husband was a tennis star, the income of sports stars in those days was nowhere near what it would become, and it couldn't support a luxurious lifestyle. Instead, he relied on Margaret's financial support to maintain their lifestyle. So Margaret was indeed a wealthy woman. Josh couldn't help but marvel at his luck. He had managed to hitchhike and meet such an extraordinary woman. From their conversation, however, it was clear that Margaret had a rather simple mindset and was not entirely happy with her current life, especially with her husband who was often away. She had a number of complaints. Although Josh didn't develop any particular feelings for Margaret, it was undoubtedly a good thing to know a woman from Chicago's upper class. Especially considering that her late father was a jeweler, which meant that if Josh could cultivate a good relationship with Margaret, he might have access to secure sources of gold in the future. After all, in the jewelry industry, several hundred or thousand kilograms of gold was no big deal. It was also mutually beneficial. It was also good for the jewelers to have an additional source of supply. The Roosevelt administration's control of gold made it difficult for the jewelry industry to get enough gold. Of course, as he extracted Margaret's personal information, Josh subtly shared some of his own. For example, he mentioned that his parents had died and that he was looking for a new place to live on his own. This, to some extent, elicited Margaret's sympathy, and she began to offer Josh help on a voluntary basis. When it comes to housing, my father has developed a community in Evanston. It may not be the best, but it's a safe neighborhood. Most of the houses have been sold, but I have a few left. You can have a look at them, Margaret recommended. Oh, I wonder how much they cost. If they're too expensive, I might not be able to afford them, Josh asked, feeling tempted. Evanston was a satellite town of Chicago. But that didn't mean Evanston was undesirable, quite the opposite. It was on the north side of Chicago. What is the north side of Chicago? It's the really wealthy part. Although Evanston was only a satellite town, its surroundings were not far from those of the north side. It was home to the famous Northwestern University. In contrast, Josh's previous residence was in the near north side, which was part of the north side, but quite different from the actual northern neighborhoods in terms of environment. Of course, it was a lot better than the black neighborhoods on the south side, Little Italy and Chinatown to the southwest, and the Irish community to the west. What? You ask why there's no east side? Of course not, because to the east is Lake Michigan. So there was no strictly defined east side, just the lakeshore area. Buy. No need to buy. You can just stay there. It's empty. Margaret shook her head. You're just a kid. You can decide when you're grown up and working. She was genuinely considering Josh's situation. After all, he was alone and not yet 16, which made it quite difficult for him to find a decent job. That won't do. Don't worry, madam, my parents left some assets before they passed away. Although it's not much, it should be enough to buy a modest house and support me until adulthood. However, Josh refused Margaret's kindness without a second thought. While he wanted to help Margaret, he didn't want to take advantage of her. Property prices in Evanston weren't cheap, but they weren't astronomical either. All right, but there's no hurry as far as the price is concerned. Let's look at the houses first. Do you have anything else to do? If not, why don't I take you to them now? Margaret suggested. Well, I don't have anything urgent, but I haven't had lunch yet. Since you've just come back from out of town, you probably haven't eaten either, have you? Josh hadn't expected this wealthy woman to be so attentive to his needs, and he didn't want to refuse her offer, but he still wanted to fill his stomach first. After all, Josh was at an age when he was growing rapidly, and missing a meal made him feel quite hungry. Margaret had been at a horse stable on the west side of Chicago that morning. Yes, that was Margaret's private property too. Given the time of their return, she probably hadn't had lunch either. I had a little snack at the stables, but now that you mention it, I am a little hungry, Margaret nodded. May I have the honor of inviting the beautiful lady to lunch? It would also be my way of thanking you, Josh suggested immediately. Of course, I know a very nice restaurant nearby. Margaret happily agreed and turned the wheel to head towards the lakeshore area. About 10 minutes later they arrived at a very upmarket restaurant on the lakeshore. However, to Josh's surprise, the restaurant that Margaret had described as very nice was not, as he had assumed, a French restaurant, but rather a Turkish one. Well, it's still one of the world's top 3 cuisines. To be honest, whether in his previous life or this one, Josh hadn't eaten much Turkish food. Of course, the concept of 3 great cuisines didn't exist in those days, especially as Chinese cuisine, which would come to dominate that list, wasn't popular at the time. Nothing could be done about that. It was a limitation of the times. After all, cuisine is a part of culture, so its popularity is closely related to the strength of a nation. Chinese cuisine only became popular worldwide after the scenes of Nixon's visit in 1972 were aired in the United States. Turkish cuisine, on the other hand, had the geographical advantage of being at the crossroads of Europe, Asia and Africa, had more interaction with Europe and was heavily influenced by Mediterranean culture. Its cooking methods, serving techniques and dining etiquette were also closer to Western cuisine, which naturally made it better known in Europe. As a result, Turkish cuisine was far more recognized in Western countries during this period than Chinese cuisine. Chapter 11. Nuhomjosh's impression was that the most famous dishes in Turkey were roasted meat and ice cream. When he looked at the menu, however, he realized that there were actually quite a few options, although the main cooking method was still roasting. What they didn't have was the world-famous doner kebab. Although it was called a Turkish kebab, it was actually invented by Germans in 1971. For the main course, he ordered a swordfish kebab, a beef kebab and roasted aubergine, and didn't order anything else because Turkish food is served in large portions. Margaret's order was simpler. She just asked for a small lamb chop and a salad. When the food arrived, Josh couldn't wait to get started. He had only bought a hot dog on his way out that morning and was already starving. While Josh was enjoying his meal with the beautiful woman, a group of people on the south side of Chicago were getting restless because of him. It was still the old warehouse, but now it was crowded with more than a dozen people where before there had been hardly anyone. Among them was a middle-aged Italian man with a somber expression, sitting confidently behind a desk with a cup of coffee in his hand. He was Eddie Scappa, third in command of the Moretti family, one of the three major families of the Chicago Mafia. The original owner of this place, a black car dealer called Mike, was now kneeling in front of the desk alongside a car thief called Joe. It was clear from the bruises on their faces that they had been given a warm welcome by Eddie's men. The atmosphere in the warehouse was tense. As a high-ranking member of the Mafia, Eddie Scappa was undoubtedly an antisocial figure. He had followed the current head of the Moretti family, Carlo Falcone, since the Prohibition era of the 1920s. They were about the same age as Josh. After nearly 20 years of struggle, they had gone from small-time bootleggers on the streets to top bosses of the Chicago Mafia, with countless lives stained on their hands. Faced with such a dangerous man, both Mike and Joe were filled with extreme fear. Mike had no idea how much he regretted taking this man's job. Just as they waited anxiously, another of Eddie's men entered the warehouse. "Boss, there's news. Someone saw this car leave town from the west and it hasn't come back since," the man said, leaning into Eddie's ear. Eddie nodded at the news and then stood up to face Mike and Joe. "My men have news. It seems you weren't lying. The other party is indeed not local and has left Chicago. It's going to be difficult to get the car back," Eddie said slowly. "Eddie, since you've checked everything out, can I go now?" Joe asked, forcing a twisted smile onto his chubby face to please Eddie. Mike, however, looked at him with a look that suggested he was an idiot. Did he really think that this guy would let them go once the matter was settled? The young man was too naive. If the Mafia were reasonable, they wouldn't be the Mafia. "Ha, leave, sure. The car is worth $8,000. Mike will pay for half, and you for the other half. Bring the money and you can go," Eddie sneered, laying out his terms. Huh, Joe was stunned. $4,000. As a petty thief, where could he get that kind of money? "What do you mean, huh? I can't find the person who stole the car, but the car was lost on your watch. You didn't protect it well, so you must take responsibility," Eddie replied coldly. "Don't say I'm being unreasonable. I'll give you a week. I don't care if you steal or rob, just get me that money. Of course, if you can get the same car, that will work too. If I don't see the money in a week, I'll throw you in the lake. Don't think you can run away. I will have someone watching you and your families. If you try to escape, I guarantee it won't just be you who dies. Of course, Joe, I know you don't have a family, but you do have friends. You wouldn't want to take your little mates down with you, would you?" Eddie said with a sneer and patted Joe on the face. Then he walked out of the warehouse without looking back, followed by his men. Only Mike and Joe were left, their faces pale. $8,000 was a lot of money. For the Mafia bosses, it was pocket change. But Joe and Mike were different. In fact, They weren't even official members of the mafia, just peripheral figures picking up the organization's scraps. For lowlifes like them, it could take years of not eating or drinking to save that kind of money, and they only had a week. "What are we going to do?" Joe asked Mike, his voice shaking. He felt he was the most innocent of all, just trying to sell a stolen old car. He hadn't made much money and yet here he was, caught up in such a mess. "I don't know. Figure it out," Mike said, avoiding Joe's pleading eyes. Unlike Joe, Mike was only an outsider to the mafia, but he had a decent amount of savings, having access to many black market car trading routes. While $8,000 was out of reach, he could scrape together $4,000 with some effort, so it was a stroke of luck for him that Joe took on half the responsibility. If he had been alone when he stole the car, he would have been in a lot of trouble. Now he might only suffer financially, but at least he wouldn't die. As for Joe, he didn't care. Of course, if he'd known that Joe's car theft had led to this mess with Josh, he probably wouldn't have thought so. Seeing Mike's evasive eyes, Joe realized that he wouldn't get any help from the old fox. All he could do was drag his beaten and bruised body out of the old warehouse, looking lost and dejected. As he watched Joe's retreating figure, Mike sighed inwardly. To come up with $4,000 in such a short time, he might have to rob a bank. Of course, there were other options like theft, robbery or smuggling, but those usually took time to liquidate, and a week wasn't enough. Josh had no idea what was going on in that old warehouse, and even if he did, he wouldn't care. After all, the whole situation was triggered by Joe stealing his car. If you do something, you pay the price. That's the way the adult world works. At that moment, Margaret was giving him a tour of his new home. Chapter 12. This food smells really good. Screech. A car screeched to a halt in front of the garage of a small villa. This attracted the attention of a middle-aged man watering flowers in the neighboring garden. Soon a handsome couple stepped out of the car. Josh and Margaret. However, when the middle-aged man saw the couple, his expression was a little strange. Although Josh and Margaret looked good together, and Josh was quite tall, the middle-aged man could easily see that Josh still had a hint of boyishness in his face, which clearly indicated that he was quite young. Margaret, on the other hand, looked like a mature woman. Furthermore, Josh's clothes, while not bad, certainly wasn't anything impressive. He was also wearing a coat that cost about $10, which meant he theoretically couldn't afford a house in this area. By comparison, Margaret's fur coat must have cost at least several $100s. So the middle-aged man couldn't help but be a little intrigued by this odd couple. After all, given the current situation, they might be his neighbors soon. Meanwhile, just as Josh got out of the car, he seemed to sense something and instinctively turned his head to make eye contact with the middle-aged man. The man smiled and nodded. Although Josh was a little surprised, he nodded politely in acknowledgement. He then turned his attention to the house in front of him. It was a standard two-story American mansion, with an exterior style that did not differ from the usual houses to be seen in America in the future. The only difference was probably the interior design and facilities. "How does it feel? Do you like it?" Margaret asked. "It's a nice house, but it must be very expensive, right?" Josh asked instinctively, although he had expected that Margaret wouldn't show him anything subpar. Seeing the actual house still exceeded his expectations. This style of villa would be very common in future America, but in this era it was definitely considered a luxury. The house was also quite large. Even though he hadn't seen the back yet, just from the scale of the front, it seemed that the area of the house wouldn't be less than 500 square meters. In addition, both the front and the back of the house had considerable yards, so Josh suddenly felt that his limited funds might not be enough. "Don't worry. It's not expensive. For $500 it's all yours," Margaret said with a cheerful smile. Josh's mouth dropped when he heard the price. This woman really thought he was a child. Well, the actual price is, okay, $2,000. Do you have enough money?" Seeing Josh's expression, Margaret realized that her initial price was unrealistic, so she immediately revised her offer, speaking carefully. "Mrs. Windus, you really don't have to do this. I'm not as broke as you think," Josh said helplessly. All right, $4,000, no more. When this neighborhood was first built, it was priced at that. You can't negotiate any further." Seeing that Josh's tone had become a bit stiff, Margaret had to compromise and set the price firmly. Otherwise you wouldn't treat me as a friend. T.N. First time seeing a buyer negotiating a price back up. Hearing this, Josh nodded. This price was not so outrageous after all. Of course, he also knew that this price was probably still lower than the actual market value, but seeing Margaret's expression, he realized that if he didn't accept this goodwill, she would probably get really upset. All right, I will buy the house at this price, but I'll have to get the money to pay you later. Josh said, money is not urgent, you can give it to me whenever you want. For now, let's go inside and have a look at the interior. If you don't like it, let me know and I can help you renovate, Margaret said, her face finally showing a satisfied smile as she pulled Josh into the house. Luckily the yard was large and the distance sufficient. Their conversation wasn't overheard by the middle-aged man watering flowers next door, otherwise he would have coughed up blood. Margaret's final price of $4,000 wasn't entirely a lie. The original asking price for this neighborhood was indeed $4,000. But there was one important detail to understand. When this neighborhood was built, it was 1934, just after the end of the Great Depression. Prices then were nothing like today's. The middle-aged man and his family had only moved here last year, and for a house of the same specification he had spent a whopping $12,000. In fact, as Josh stepped inside, he realized that he had underestimated the value of this house. Although the interior could hardly be described as luxurious, it was incredibly exquisite. There was a radio, fridge and telephone. Josh even spotted an air conditioner and a television. In America, refrigerators was an early success. About 85% households in America had refrigerators by the early 1940s, so Josh wasn't surprised. But air conditioners and televisions were different. Although they were invented around the same time, especially air conditioners, which preceded televisions and refrigerators by 20 years, for technical reasons air conditioners and televisions were still considered luxury items before the Second World War, and only began to be widely adopted by average households after the war. So on this day in 1943, these two appliances were still considered luxury items. How does it feel? The decor isn't bad, is it? Seeing Josh lost in thought, Margaret asked with some anticipation. It's great, so great that I can't find the words to describe it, Josh replied seriously. This was truly from the heart, without a hint of false pretense. After all, in his previous life, in the 21st century, house prices in his home country were frighteningly high. After working hard for half his life, he was only able to buy a property of about 150 square meters with the help of his parents. And by help, he meant that his parents covered 80% of the cost. Even then, it cost more than $2 million. What was even more annoying was that out of those 150 square meters, 30 square meters were for common areas. Thinking about it, Josh felt like hanging certain real estate developers from the polls. I'm glad you like it. The bedding and everything in the rooms is brand new, and you can move in today. Getting around here can be tricky, though, so you'll need a car. I can help you find a new one. By the way, you don't have a driving license yet, do you? I can take you to get one later, Margaret chattered on. Seeing Margaret's serious instructions, Josh couldn't help but feel a wave of emotion. Life was unpredictable. Just a week ago he had been worrying about how to fill his stomach, and now he was living in such a luxurious residence. Had he managed to latch on to a rich woman and now he was living off her? But to be honest, this, living off, was truly delightful. Chapter 13. Borrowing a car. Josh and Margaret spent the afternoon in the new house, but in the end Josh didn't stay there that day. Although he had already been given the keys and the house was fairly well furnished, the problem was that the fridge and other essentials were empty and the nearest restaurant was quite a distance away. Without a car, it was indeed inconvenient. Although Josh had borrowed a luxury car, it was not something he could openly use. It could only serve as a collectible or for special circumstances. As for a new car, Margaret had already arranged one, but the earliest it could be delivered was the next day. So, as the time drew near, the two returned to town. After a meal together, Margaret dropped Josh off at his place. Aren't you going to invite me up for a while? As Josh got out of the car, Margaret leaned back on the steering wheel and smiled as she asked. Ma'am, you know I live alone, so it's a bit messy at home, but of course, if you don't mind. Hearing Margaret's teasing, Josh couldn't help but scratch his head. In truth, he wouldn't have minded getting involved with this beautiful woman, but his place was a bit of a mess and he had been too busy with life to tidy up. As a citizen of a certain country in the past, he was really not used to bringing a woman he barely knew back to his home under such circumstances. "Ha ha, I was only joking. Go home and get some rest, I'll pick you up tomorrow morning." Seeing the boy's somewhat shy and awkward demeanor, Margaret laughed happily. Although they had only known each other for a day, Josh had clearly made a very good impression on her, even giving her a sense of love at first sight. However, during their previous interactions, Josh had behaved too maturely. His attentiveness to various details had made Margaret feel very comfortable, but had also aroused a twinge of pity in her. After all, she thought, what could a 15-year-old boy have experienced to be so knowledgeable about social matters? Only now did she catch a glimpse of youthful awkwardness in Josh. "How about afternoon? I have a few things to do in the morning," Josh said, feeling a little relieved that Margaret didn't seem overly concerned. This morning he had borrowed a car to get back at the thief who had stolen his, and then he had met Margaret, who then eventually took him to look at houses, which had completely disrupted his original plans. While his life was at stake, the more pressing matter was still the arms deal with Daenerys. But as it was getting late and he didn't have a car, he'd have to wait until tomorrow. In this era and in the future, stores in America usually close early, most close around 5 or 6 o'clock, with only a few neighborhoods staying open a bit later, but they usually wouldn't go past 9, and gun shops generally fall into the earlier category. So if Josh wanted to buy a gun, it was already a bit late. So he planned to get a car tonight and then buy a gun tomorrow morning. Although Margaret had said she would get him a new car, it wouldn't hurt for Josh to get a few more vehicles, especially undocumented or stolen ones, to have on hand for special situations, like when he found himself out of town without a vehicle. Finally, the trading system's inventory had plenty of space. Although the system's storage wasn't infinite, 1,000 cubic kilometers was more than enough to hold an entire international metropolis. Moreover, time was frozen within the system's space, so there was no risk of the items inside deteriorating. In fact, with such a vast space, even without trading partners, Josh could make a lot of money. Smuggling. After all, customs wouldn't be able to detect anything even if they peeled him like an onion. TN. This had me laughing bad, lol, but right now, Josh was too weak to take that risk. After all, judges need proof, but those in this line of work do not. As long as they suspect you of stealing their business, they have every reason to act. In that era, when business practices were still rather crude, the disappearance of a few people wouldn't raise an eyebrow. "All right, I'll come by around 1 in the afternoon." When Margaret heard that Josh had things to do, she didn't ask too many questions and immediately suggested another time. Josh had no objections. Having reached an agreement, the two said their goodbyes. But as soon as Margaret's car was out of sight, Josh turned and walked in another direction. After about 10 minutes, Josh arrived at a car park, sneaking in when the guard wasn't looking. The rest of the steps were quite simple. He could simply take any car he wanted and store it in the system's warehouse. At this point, some may wonder how useful it would be to take a car without the keys. However, in this time and age, as long as you could unlock the car door, you could easily drive the car away without needing the keys. Because the car keys of this time period served merely as a simple anti-theft measure to unlock the doors. The starting mechanism for cars was similar to the one-button start that people in the 21st century are familiar with. That's right, one-button start, not key ignition. The only difference was that in the future, one-button start required the driver to have an electronic key with chip recognition, whereas in the past, this was not the case. In fact, the first generation of cars didn't even need a key. Before 1927, cars used a hand crank to start, similar to tractors of the 80s and 90s. After 1927, with the invention of electronic ignition, one-button starting became a thing. The mechanical key ignition of later generations was invented by Chrysler after 1949. So when Josh borrowed a car from the old warehouse and locked Joe and Mike inside, he had to pour a pot of coffee into the old Ford's gas tank. The insistence on using the key to the Cadillac V16 was simply to avoid damaging the window. If he had been a bit more forceful, he could have just smashed the window to get in and driven off. But Josh didn't want to risk damaging a collectible luxury car, of which only just over 4,000 were produced worldwide. But if it was just a spare car for temporary situations, that wouldn't be a problem. He could find an empty space, smash a window and drive off. So as soon as he entered the car park, Josh didn't hesitate. He borrowed 7 or 8 standard black saloons and then quietly left, avoiding the guard at the entrance to the car park. The whole process went very smoothly, but Josh wouldn't allow himself to feel smug about it, nor did he want to think that the existence of the systems warehouse gave him a free hand to steal other things. After all, other places wouldn't be as defenseless as a car park where there was practically no security. Chapter 14. Sugar back at home. Josh checked the time on his watch. It was around 7 in the evening. After a moment's thought, he summoned the system. This time, however, Daenerys took a while to appear. Josh waited a full 15 minutes, and just as he was starting to get impatient, Daenerys finally appeared on the screen, dressed in a revealing outfit. "Uh-oh, looks like I interrupted something good," Josh said with a teasing smile, glancing at the screen where Daenerys appeared flushed and seemingly in a good mood. Clearly, this queen from another world had just been through an intense battle. Josh guessed that Daenerys had returned to Meereen and her opponent must have been Daario Naharis, the leader of Second Sons, a sellsword company. "Now that you know, next time choose a better time," Daenerys replied nonchalantly to Josh's teasing. The culture of Westeros is quite liberal. Daenerys has experienced more embarrassing situations than this, so Josh's playful remarks hardly stirred her emotions. "There is a problem, though. While business is important, it's not ideal if it interferes with our personal lives. So let's set a fixed time. If something unexpected causes us to miss it, the trade will be postponed until the next day," Josh suggested. "That's fair. What time do you suggest?" Daenerys replied, showing no objection. "How about 7 p.m. system time? We'll wait 10 minutes, so if one of us hasn't shown up by 7:10, we'll automatically reschedule for the next day. That way, unless there's an emergency, we don't have to worry about interrupting each other," Josh explained, glancing at the system clock. Even though they were in different dimensions, the trading system reminded him that time flowed at the same rate in all trading realms, and synchronized with Josh's current time in Chicago. "Sounds good." After a moment's thought, Daenerys agreed. This time also coincided with her rest period, as the nightlife in Westeros is rather dull. She had some time on her hands and had been preoccupied with Daario, who had been particularly aggressive in battle, so she was reluctant to wrap things up. "Now that we've settled the time, do you have any surprises for me today?" Daenerys asked after confirming their regular trading schedule. "Sorry, I've had a bit of an unexpected situation today, so I haven't been able to stock up. To make up for it, I've prepared something else for you," Josh replied, placing 2 brown paper bags in the trading section of the system and initiating the trade without asking for money. "What is it?" Daenerys asked, showing no resentment towards Josh. While she valued firearms, she had already amassed one of the most powerful military forces in Westeros, so her need for them wasn't immediate. However, she was looking forward to the new item Josh had brought from another world. "Some sugar and chocolate," Josh shrugged. As he mentioned, the 2 brown paper bags contained a pound of sugar and a pound of chocolate, just under a kilo each. He had bought them earlier in the day after lunch when he and Margot had gone house hunting. Although the amount might seem small, it wasn't because Josh was stingy. Sugar was one of the most heavily regulated commodities during the American War, even more so than tires and petrol. The weekly ration of sugar, including chocolate, was only 0.25 pounds per person, or about 113 grams. Thus, this pound of white sugar and a pound of chocolate were all the sugar vouchers that the black market dealer Mike had managed to stock up. "I know sugar, but what is chocolate?" When Daenerys heard sugar, she didn't think too much about it. As Queen of Meereen, she certainly wasn't deprived of it. However, she was intrigued by Josh's mention of chocolate. "It's a sweet made from fruits unique to our world, with mood-lifting effects," Josh explained. "Wait, that's sugar, so pure sugar." Upon hearing Josh's explanation, Daenerys became visibly interested. But when she opened the bag of white sugar, she was astonished. While Westeros had dragons, magic and possibly gods, its productivity was, frankly, probably inferior to that of medieval Europe. So even if there was sugar, It was probably only the coarse brown sugar lumps. Fine white sugar was something she had never come across. Exactly. That's sugar. It's called white sugar because it's as fine as white gravel, Josh nodded. Oh my gosh, that taste. Such pure sweetness. After Josh confirmed it, Daenerys carefully used her slender little fingernail to scoop up a small pinch of white sugar and slowly brought it to her lips. It was as if she had tasted something divine, and she closed her eyes to savor the moment. Watching Daenerys, careful tasting and her ecstatic expression, Josh couldn't help but twitch his lips. For a moment he even doubted if what he had given her was sugar or some kind of indescribable source of pleasure. Sorry, I lost my composure a bit, but I've really never tasted such pure sweetness before. After enjoying it for a while, Daenerys finally came to her senses and said to Josh. Don't worry, but I think you'll like chocolate even more after you've tasted it, Josh shrugged. Thank you, I'll savor it, but such pure sugar must be expensive, right? Daenerys couldn't help but ask. Yes, it's quite expensive as it's a strictly controlled strategic commodity, Josh nodded. The 2 pounds of sugar and chocolate cost him $4, not including the ration coupons. And how much does ordinary beef cost? 40 cents a pound. That's the price, even with ration coupons. If he bought it on the black market, it would probably cost many times more. No doubt this price was astronomical compared to the cheap price of white sugar in later generations. In fact, sugar prices in America were still relatively cheap. During the Second World War, the most exaggerated price increase for sugar was actually for sugar chickens. At its peak, the price of sugar rose 770-fold from pre-war levels, while the price of food, petrol and other war supplies rose only about 50-fold. By the end of the Second World War, a U.S. soldier could buy a sweet and caring wife with just 1 bar of chocolate. When Josh mentioned that it was quite expensive, it was still relative to the cheaper prices of later generations. However, Daenerys misunderstood him and thought that Josh had spent a considerable amount of gold. Fans of Game of Thrones know that, as queen, Daenerys was very generous to her supporters. And even though Josh wasn't one of her subjects, she felt she couldn't let him suffer a loss after giving him such a precious piece of food. So she waved her little hand in the air, and a trade request sounded from the system. Josh was stunned. The trading section showed an astonishing amount of gold, 1,000 ounces. Approximately 28.3495 kg. Is this woman crazy? Josh knew that sugar was expensive in ancient times, but in general, after the sugar shortages of medieval Europe and the sugar chicken of the Second World War, the price would at most be equal to the price of gold. But 1,000 ounces for 2 pounds of sugar. That's already 30 times the price of gold. Why sell weapons when you could sell sugar instead? Fortunately, Daenerys' next words made it clear to Josh that she hadn't lost her mind. Chapter 15. Moving. I know this may be difficult, but I still hope you can find a way to provide me with as much sugar as possible. Oh, and this chocolate too. This gold, half of it is a thank you gift for you, and the other half is a deposit. I won't bother with the actual purchase price of the sugar, I'll buy it at 5 ounces per pound. How does that sound? Daenerys said seriously. She was a queen, after all. Though young, she had already endured many hardships and was no ignorant little flower. Daenerys understood the importance of white sugar. If powerful firearms could help her defeat her enemies by force, then white sugar was essential to maintaining the fighting power of her army and winning over allies. If she were to retake Westeros, sending the same weight of white sugar to a noble lord would be 100 times more effective than sending the same weight of gold. As for the price of 5 ounces per pound, Daenerys derived this figure from the raw sugar blocks in her world. No doubt this quality of white sugar would still be underpriced compared to the inferior sugar of Westeros. However, Daenerys might also suspect that while sugar in Josh's world might not be cheap, it was certainly not as expensive as in Westeros. This was not mere speculation, it was based on the conclusions she had drawn from the weapons Josh had sold her earlier. And why? Because of the metal. By the time of the Second World War, Earth's industrial level had reached an advanced stage. The steel produced was nothing like the special steels of later times, but it was worlds away from medieval production. When Josh first recommended firearms to Daenerys, she was only interested in their power. However, once she received the actual weapon, her interest extended beyond the weapon itself to the metals used to make the guns and bullets. During their first trade, When she received the .38, Daenerys had already tested it. The best weapons used by her warriors could only leave light scratches on the gun without causing any real damage. On closer inspection, she discovered that the so-called scratches were merely on an unknown coating. This weapon was nickel-plated. Such robust steel could be said to rival the legendary Valyrian steel. In Westeros, steel of this caliber would cost many times more than gold. It was even comparable to the legendary swords in martial arts novels, such as the Sword of Heaven and the Dragon Slayer's blade, that couldn't be bought with money. And how much does a .38 weigh? Just over a kilogram. Even without the non-metallic parts, converted to imperial ounces, that would be no less than 30 ounces. Josh sold it to her for just 10 ounces of gold, along with a free book on monarch theory. Later, the M1917 rifle was even heavier, weighing 8 kilograms. Without the wooden stock, it was still no less than 2 kilos, and it even came with 100 bullets. Moreover, both the .38 and the M1917 bullets were cast in pure copper. So even though the price had tripled, Daenerys hadn't lost out at all. In fact, if one day Josh stopped selling her bullets, those guns wouldn't just be considered firewood by Josh. Just recovering the steel and casings from the bullets would allow Daenerys to cover all her losses and still make a profit. Besides, there was no problem with the recoverability of the steel. It's true that steelmaking requires high productivity, but if it's just a matter of remelting, the difficulty drops significantly. Like Valyrian steel, while the people of Westeros couldn't make it, remelting Valyrian steel weapons wasn't difficult at all. So Josh always thought he was getting a great deal. But in reality, he was only at the stratosphere, while Daenerys had already reached the space. This was one of the biggest advantages of interdimensional trade. Now Daenerys used this information gap to give her estimate of the price of white sugar. Faced with Daenerys' offer, Josh was no doubt tempted. Is white sugar expensive? At $2 a pound, it certainly is. And if he wanted to make a big deal at that price, it would be impossible, because ration coupons are extremely difficult to obtain. So he had to buy on the black market. On the black market, the price of sugar was at least $5 a pound. However, compared to Daenerys' offer of 5 ounces of gold 80% purity, which works out at $250 per pound, it was still incredibly cheap. That's a whopping 50-fold profit. The M1917 rifle he had previously sold had barely yielded a 25 times profit. This deal was definitely worth pursuing. I'll do my best, but I can't guarantee the quantity, Josh said after some thought and immediately agreed, but he didn't want to overpromise given the strict controls on supplies. That's fine, just do your best. Daenerys understood that it wouldn't be easy. After discussing what needed to be discussed, they said their goodbyes. And ended the call. As the call ended, Josh looked at the 100 bars of gold in the system warehouse and felt an exhilarating rush again. Even though he had seen gold every day recently, each transaction brought him more wealth than the last. It was a wonderful feeling. If it were all in cash, Josh would even consider taking out a note to imitate the extravagant way a certain character lit a cigarette. Of course, this was just a thought. Firstly, Josh didn't smoke, and secondly, while this character lit his cigarette in a flamboyant manner, he was a counterfeiter and used counterfeit notes to light his cigarette. A night soon passed. The next day Josh woke up very late and his plans changed again. He had originally planned to visit various gun shops to buy more firearms, as after paying for his house he wouldn't have much left to stock up on. He planned to buy some weapons in the morning and then meet Daenerys for a transaction around midday. But the sugar deal had suddenly given him 1,000 ounces of gold, so there was no hurry. What? Half of it's a deposit. Just kidding. Once it's in Josh's pocket, do they expect him to give it back? It almost amounted 100 pounds of sugar. Even if he cleared out the black market, he would still find a way to gather it. After nibbling on some leftover bread and milk to fill his stomach, he began to pack his things. There wasn't much to pack, as most of the important items had already been stored in the system warehouse, so he just casually threw some clothes into a box. He also prepared a delicate wooden box and placed 50 gold bars inside. The rest was just waiting for Margaret's arrival. Chapter 16. Neighbors. Josh, have you been waiting long? Around 1 in the afternoon, a brand new car pulled up in front of Josh, and Margaret got out and hugged Josh warmly. Not at all. It's an honor to wait for the most beautiful woman in the world. Josh complimented her. "Oh, Josh, you're quite the charmer," Margaret laughed, her face lighting up at the praise. Then she pointed to the driveway. "This is the car I prepared for you. What do you think? Do you like it? It's a little flashy, but it's beautiful." "I really like it," Josh replied, raising an eyebrow as he looked at the car. No doubt, since Margaret was a wealthy woman, her gifts wouldn't be ordinary. While this car might not be up there with the Cadillac V16, it was still on par with Margaret's own Packard. It was a 1942 Lincoln Continental, the last sedan Lincoln produced before the United States entered the war. Although it had lost the elegant curves of the first-generation 1939 European-style model due to updates, it was more in line with Josh's aesthetic. The only downside was that, as Josh had mentioned, it was a bit too showy. Well, it wasn't the model itself that was flashy, it was the color. It was burgundy. TN. Purplish red. Young people should be a little more vibrant. "You look a little too mature for your age," Margaret said, seemingly unimpressed. "Come on, get in the car. You should drive." When they visited the house yesterday, Josh had mentioned that he could drive. Margaret didn't believe him at first, but after letting him try, she discovered that Josh's driving skills were even better than hers, so she wasn't worried about him. As she spoke, Margaret reached out to grab Josh's suitcase beside him. Josh had two suitcases, a large one and a small one. The larger one was a classic 28-inch leather case from that era. The smaller one looked to be only 7 or 8 inches. Margaret didn't overestimate herself and try to lift the larger suitcase, as it looked quite heavy. Instead, she decided to try the smaller one. But as soon as she lifted it, she almost tripped. Fortunately, Josh caught her quickly. Gosh, if he hadn't acted quickly, it wouldn't have been just a minor accident. If the case had broken and spilled its contents, it would have been a disaster. "What's in this suitcase? Why is it so heavy?" Margaret said, a little shaken after almost falling. Although she said it was heavy, it only weighed about 30 pounds, which wasn't enough to be beyond her capacity. It just exceeded her estimate, and she had pulled too hard, causing her to almost fall. "It's not convenient to explain here. When we get to Evanston, you'll know," Josh said mysteriously, putting the small suitcase in the car. "Wow, I'm looking forward to it." Seeing Josh's attitude made Margaret even more curious. They had no delays on the road, and Josh quickly arrived at the house in Evanston. This time, the middle-aged man next door wasn't watering the flowers. He was in the yard, enjoying afternoon tea with his wife under the warm winter sun. "Tommy, are those our new neighbors?" "Looks like we have neighbors now," the middle-aged man's wife remarked, intrigued by the young couple's arrival. "No, we've always had neighbors. It's that girl. She just doesn't live here. It looks like our new neighbor is going to be that boy, Tommy," the middle-aged man explained. After Josh and Margaret visited yesterday, he did some research and found out that the house next door has always been occupied by a wealthy young woman. So Tommy quickly thought of Margaret. "Should we invite her for coffee? After all, they're neighbors," Tommy's wife suggested. "Ha ha, let's not disturb the young couple. Look at that boy with his luggage, he obviously just moved in today. They might just be making themselves at home," Tommy teased with a smile. "Well, you're right," Tommy's wife nodded, slightly embarrassed by the memories of the reckless things they did when they were young. In this era, such behavior might have been frowned upon in China. But, in Europe and America, it was still considered normal. Back in their youth, she and Tommy had done even more outrageous things. Thinking about it made her blush a little. "What's wrong, Sarah?" Tommy noticed his wife's reaction and, curious, put his hand on her leg, feigning ignorance. Although they had been married long enough to be considered old partners, Tommy had spent 4 of the last 5 years away from his family. It was only after moving here last year that they were reunited. They say that distance makes the heart grow fonder, and being apart for 4 years had intensified their feelings for each other. Besides, they weren't old. Tommy was in his early 40s, and his wife had just turned 40, still a vibrant age. "Come on, don't be silly. You have to pick up the kids later." His wife, sensing her husband's unseemly behavior, rolled her eyes and slapped his hand away. American students got out of school early. Even in the 21st century, they usually got out around 3 in the afternoon. In the 1940s, schoolwork was far less demanding than in later years, and school ended at about the same time, if not a little earlier. So now, after 2 o'clock, it was certainly not the time for romantic gestures. Realizing this, Tommy could only reluctantly withdraw his hand. At the same time, in the house next door, Josh and Margaret were not getting cozy, as Tommy and his wife had speculated. After all, they had only known each other for 2 days. Although Margaret had a strong liking for Josh, she wasn't so forward as to be intimate so quickly. She still retained a bit of a lady's decency. Besides, if it hadn't been for her husband's change in behavior after the marriage, his long absences and indulgences, Margaret might not have developed feelings for Josh, something she hadn't revealed to him. For Margaret had already discovered that her husband, using his fame as a star athlete, had taken on more than one mistress outside the home, using her money to support them. At that moment, Margaret's condition was similar to that of Rose in Titanic, who longed to escape the cage of her original life. However, Margaret had the advantage over Rose in that her husband's betrayal preceded her own feelings for Josh, while Rose, though engaged to Cal Hockley, quickly ran off with Jack. In addition, Rose was only a bankrupt noblewoman, while Margaret, though not a noblewoman herself, had the upper hand financially. The marriage laws of the time were not as well established as they would be later, and the family's wealth came from Margaret's inheritance. If she took advantage of her husband's betrayal, Margaret's tennis-playing husband wouldn't see a penny after the divorce. Likewise, Josh wasn't Jack. Jack was a real poor guy who had won a third-class ticket at poker. But Josh was not poor. For example, when Josh opened the small suitcase, the 500 ounces of gold bars, weighing nearly 15 kilograms, left Margaret speechless for a moment. This was certainly not because Margaret had never seen money before. After all, even at black market prices, 500 ounces of gold was worth over $20,000, and Margaret's wealth was hundreds of times that amount. It was just that when Josh had claimed to be wealthy before, she had thought he was just puffing up his pride. She never expected that he actually had a lot of money. Chapter 17. Ferdinand Chicken. This was left to me by my father. I had a piece tested and they said it was low quality, only about 80% pure, Josh said, pointing to the gold in the box. As long as I exchange this gold for dollars at the bank, I can pay for this house. What? The bank? No, we can't go to the bank to exchange it, Margaret replied immediately after hearing Josh's words. Why not? Josh feigned ignorance. It's not worth it. The bank's exchange rate is just a government gimmick to extract money from the public. If it were a regular transaction, it should be at least $50 an ounce, according to the current market, Margaret explained. Although she was a wealthy young lady and not adept at managing finances, Margaret was not completely ignorant. She had some basic economic knowledge. So where do I exchange it? Josh asked. That's easy. Leave it to me. Uncle John needs a lot of gold right now, and this amount will be easy for him to handle, Margaret said confidently. Uncle John. Josh was confused. He's the one who took over my father's jewelry business, and he was also my father's partner. They had a great relationship. After my father died, I was not good at running things, so I sold most of my shares to him, keeping only a small portion, Margaret explained. That is wonderful, but won't that be too much trouble for you? Josh expressed his gratitude. It's not an inconvenience. This is mutually beneficial. Don't think the bank's price for gold is $35 an ounce. If you sell it to companies that need it, while the price stays the same, when you factor in various fees and approval processes, the actual cost isn't much less than buying it at a high price on the black market. Plus, the supply is limited. Uncle John's business hasn't been easy these past few years. Margaret shook her head. Hearing Margaret's words, Josh nodded. He was aware of that aspect as well. The U.S. government was quite adept at extracting wealth from its citizens and the world. Although it seemed that Roosevelt's New Deal had saved the American economy 10 years ago, the government was actually deeply in debt at the time and had little money to implement the New Deal. Yet the New Deal was successfully implemented, but where did the money come from? The answer was, by taxing the public. The first piece of New Deal legislation was the Emergency Banking Act, which devalued the dollar against gold and banned the export of gold. It forced the public to turn over their gold at $20.67 an ounce and ordered American gold miners to sell their gold to the Treasury at the same price. Then, just 1 year later, the gold exchange price was raised to $35 per ounce, effectively devaluing the dollar by 40%. This meant that the wealth in the hands of the public had directly shrunk by 40%. The government got richer while the common people got poorer. This ability to extract wealth was remarkable. And consider how the dollar often depreciates in the future, or how the government gives money to the public at the slightest expense. Thus, wealth extraction had become a traditional skill of the U.S. government. "I've helped you again. Shouldn't you thank me?" After the matter was settled, Margaret teased. "Of course. That's why I want to cook dinner for you." Josh smiled slightly. "Oh, you can cook." Margaret was very surprised to hear that. "Of course I can. Just wait and see, but first we have to buy some ingredients," Josh said. "Oh, I can't wait," Margaret said with a beaming smile. So they got back in the car and drove to the nearest farmer's market. Supermarkets had been around in America since the 1940s, but at that time they sold mostly national brand products and did not carry fresh produce. Supermarkets were usually located far out in the suburbs. In the early 1940s, refrigerators were not widely available and conventional foods lacked preservation methods, making distant supermarkets unsuitable for the shopping needs of residents of that era. As a result, the primary source of fresh food at the time was small retail stores, roadside stands, or farmers' markets that resembled vegetable markets. Basically, local farmers would sell their homegrown fruits, vegetables, honey, and other agricultural products. After wandering around the farmers' market, Josh quickly bought beef, chicken, salmon, lettuce, onions, potatoes, mushrooms, and carrots. He had no intention of making authentic Chinese food. It wasn't that he couldn't, but he lacked the necessary ingredients. Here, he couldn't find essential ingredients like scallions, ginger, and garlic, nor soy sauce or cooking wine. The only spices he could find were rosemary, cinnamon, ketchup, and chili peppers. There were actually chili peppers, because America was the home of chili. In addition to ingredients, cooking equipment was also an issue. There was no wok tn. A wok is a deep round-bottomed cooking pan of Chinese origin. At home, they only had an oven, a frying pan, and a grill. So he had to prepare some dishes that were a mix of Chinese and Western styles. For example, beef could be steamed with tomatoes and potatoes. The chicken could be made with ketchup and cornstarch, resulting in a dish that would be familiar in America but confusing to the Chinese. General Tso's chicken, basically just chicken cooked in a sweet and sour tomato sauce. It was very simple, created in the 1950s by a renowned chef to serve the commander of the U.S. 7th Fleet. The salmon was prepared in the standard Western way, baked with a little lemon juice, sprinkled with salt and pepper, and garnished with rosemary. Finally, the vegetables were shredded lettuce, carrots, and mushrooms, casually sautéed in a frying pan. As for the staple food, it was bread, of course. 2 freshly baked baguettes would solve all problems. One could say that the dishes prepared in this way would probably be rejected by the Chinese. But it was enough to impress foreigners. If he really wanted to make authentic Chinese food, he would have to wait until he had time to go to Chinatown to gather the necessary spices and utensils. Wow, this is really sumptuous. The chicken is delicious. Is it an Austrian specialty? What's it called? Although Josh considered this to be a rather simple dinner, the overall sweet and sour flavor clearly suited Margaret's palate, and she was thoroughly enjoying it, especially the somewhat incongruous General Tso's chicken. Yes, indeed. This is Austrian cuisine, called Ferdinand chicken. After looking at the General Tso's chicken, Josh firmly stated that he would not admit that this was Chinese food. Besides, it was completely inappropriate for him, an Austrian, to be making Chinese food. So it was Austrian cuisine, Ferdinand chicken. No mistake. As for why it was called Ferdinand, apart from the failed art student, Josh could only think of the spark that ignited the First World War. And so, in a rather mysterious way, a dish that would later become popular in America, Ferdinand chicken, was born all over Austria. Chapter 18. Tony Windus. After dinner, Josh drove Margaret home. Margaret's home was a small estate on Chicago's wealthy north side. As Josh looked at the spacious property and the scattered lights from the servants' quarters, he began to understand Margaret's loneliness a little better. He gave Margaret a gentle hug and watched her enter the mansion before driving away. What Josh didn't know was that as soon as Margaret entered the mansion, she saw someone in the living room. It was no surprise to find a familiar face there at that hour. The person was none other than Margaret's almost absent husband, tennis star Tony Windus. What a rare guest. I thought you'd forgotten you had a home, Margaret said with a hint of sarcasm when she saw Tony, who made her a little nervous at first, but quickly regained her composure. After all, what did she have to be nervous about? She and Josh were completely innocent, at least so far. Apart from a polite hug, there had been no overly intimate acts. It was this man standing before her who had been caught red-handed several times. Who is he? Tony Windus asked stiffly, ignoring Margaret's sarcasm. Just a friend, and what does that have to do with you? Margaret replied contemptuously. I'm your husband, how could it have nothing to do with me? Tony Windus shot back angrily. Oh, you remember you're my husband. How many days did you spend with me last year? If you hadn't shown up today, I might have forgotten you even existed. Margaret said sarcastically as she went upstairs to her bedroom. I was working, Tony Windus replied, a mixture of embarrassment and anger rising in him. Working? Oh, what a perfect excuse. And what did you earn? How much did you spend at home? To maintain your respectable image, you even take a large sum of money from me every year. If that were all, that would be one thing, but where has my money really gone? To that little star named Amy? Or that singer named Carly? Or maybe those brothels? Tony Windus' words ignited Margaret's anger and she replied without holding back. You're investigating me. Tony Windus was taken aback by Margaret's answer. Investigating? Do you think that's necessary? Do you really think what you're doing is so secret? Many people have told me about it. Don't think that just because my father is dead that no one cares about me. And don't think that I can't live without you. Tomorrow, I'll have my lawyer draw up a divorce agreement. Now get out of my room, Margaret said, her anger rising, before she slammed the bedroom door before Tony could react. Hey, Margaret, let's not do this. We can sit down and talk about this. Tony Windus panicked when he heard Margaret mention her father's friends and the divorce. As Margaret pointed out, his comfortable lifestyle did not come from his identity as a tennis star. The money he earned from tournaments and endorsements was not enough to support one mistress, let alone two. If they divorced, with Margaret's family connections and her fortune, he would probably walk away with nothing. Margaret, I know I was wrong. I shouldn't have treated you like this. Let's talk about it and I promise to change. Tony Windus kept knocking on the door, trying to ease the tension between them. Was he worried about losing face? Not at all. As long as he didn't get divorced and could maintain his current luxurious lifestyle, he didn't care about a little embarrassment. This time, however, he miscalculated Margaret's anger and determination. No matter how he softened his tone or apologized, Margaret inside the room completely ignored him. He didn't dare to force his way in. If he angered Margaret further, it would lead to trouble. Damn it. Margaret used to be so gentle. As he thought about the previous version of Margaret, Tony Windus wondered what could have caused such a drastic change in her. He soon remembered Josh, who had just dropped Margaret off. Even though it was night and the streetlights were dim, he could tell that Josh was a tall, young and handsome man. So she found a new boyfriend. Tony Windus quickly blamed Josh, whom he had never met, for the situation. With that thought, his mood soured even more. Since Margaret wouldn't answer the door, Tony Windus had no choice but to go down to the guest room. However, Margaret's behavior made it impossible for him to relax, so he spent only a few minutes in the guest room before leaving to find a place to drink. Inside the room, Margaret heard the sound of the car engine starting, went to the window and watched Tony Windus drive away. A hint of contempt crossed her face. She knew he was probably going out to fool around. She had seen through the man. At the same time, her determination to get a divorce grew stronger. On the other hand, after leaving the estate, Tony Windus quickly arrived at a brothel, just as Margaret had suspected. In America, brothels had slowly become illegal since the founding of the country. Despite their illegality, however, there were no specific restrictive laws against them. Moreover, these operations generally paid their taxes and protection money to local police, so the federal government turned a blind eye. It wasn't until 1978, when Pennsylvania passed specific legislation, that these semi-public brothels began to be shut down in various states, leaving only Nevada, which still exists today. The brothel Tony Windus visited was the largest in Chicago, located on the west side. As soon as he got out of the car, he noticed some Italians in a nearby alley, yelling and beating someone. Tony glanced over, but didn't pay them any attention and went straight inside. "Mr. Windus, welcome back. The girls have been asking for you." The doorman greeted him warmly as soon as he entered. "Call for Mary and Nancy. By the way, what's going on in the alley? The Italians are causing trouble and Brian isn't handling it," Tony Windus said, mentioning the two girls' names and slipping the doorman a $5 tip. The west side was Irish territory, and Brian was the overseer of this establishment. It was unusual for Italians to cause trouble in an Irish-owned place. "Thank you, sir. Normally, Mr. Brian wouldn't allow Italians to cause trouble on the west side, but this guy is Italian, too. I hear he owes their boss a lot of money. Normally it wouldn't be a problem. Guests are welcome here, but this guy came here looking for girls even though he's broke. That's just asking for trouble. The Italians want to get even with him, so Mr. Brian has no desire to get involved. I heard he used to be a big shot in the Southwest, but now. Haha. His days are numbered," the doorman said, laughing as he shared the information he knew. "Oh, how much does he owe?" Tony Windus asked casually, understanding that if the guy couldn't pay, his life would probably be forfeit. "I hear it's several thousand," the doorman replied. "Only a few thousand, and they want his life." Tony Windus blurted out, "Mr. Windus, you're joking. To someone like you, a few thousand is nothing. But for us little people, unless we rob a bank, it would take at least 10 or 8 years to save up that much," the doorman said with a hint of self-deprecation. Tony Windus understood immediately what the porter meant. Yes, before he met Margaret, saving a few $100s a year was a blessing. Several thousand was enough to buy a life. He couldn't help but shiver at the thought. If Margaret really divorced him, would he end up in the same unfortunate situation as that guy? And the thought began to swell uncontrollably in his mind. Chapter 19. $10,000, "Sir, are you looking for me?" In the luxurious private room of the brothel, a bruised and battered Joe cautiously looked over at Tony Windus, who was held in the arms of two beautiful women. In fact, the one being beaten up in the alley outside was none other than Joe Barbaro, who had earlier stolen Josh's car. At this point, 2 days had passed since the deadline set by Mafia boss Scappa. During those 2 days, Joe had not been completely idle. He had planned a bank robbery. It was the quickest way he could think of to raise money. However, robbing a bank was not an easy task. It had not been many years since the end of the Great Depression. The Chicago police, who had been through that chaotic period, were well prepared in terms of firepower. While they did not use submachine guns and automatic weapons, shotguns and rifles were standard in every patrol car. As anyone who has seen John Dillinger's Public Enemy knows, trying to rob a bank without 4 or 5 accomplices, sufficient firepower, and a getaway car was essentially a death sentence. Besides, it wasn't just the police. Most bank security guards were also armed with shotguns. What did Joe have? Other than an M1911, he had nothing. Of course, he could steal a car. He had done it many times in the past to make some extra cash, and he was familiar with it. But guns and manpower were different. Good weapons had to be bought with real money, and reliable manpower was needed. These preparations could not be made in a short time. It would take a considerable amount of time to prepare. There were certainly people who acted rashly and walked into a bank with a gun, but 99% of them ended up dead in the street. Joe's goal was to get money, not end up dead. So he could not act rashly. Today he had come to the west side to find an old friend, hoping to persuade him to join him. However, as soon as he mentioned it, his friend flatly refused because he had just gotten involved with the Irish gang and found a nice source of income. It was not very profitable, but it was low risk. Given the situation, he certainly didn't want to risk everything to rob a bank with Joe. He rudely kicked Joe out. They had only hung out on the street together when they were both poor, so they didn't have a strong bond and naturally wouldn't give Joe much face. The rejection left Joe very depressed, and he wandered aimlessly until he ended up at the brothel. In a moment of impulse, he decided to stroll in and have a good time, not caring that he had no money in his pocket. Since Joe had visited this place occasionally when he had some money, the doorman and the girls inside didn't suspect that he was trying to eat and run. In fact, he almost got away with it. using the excuse that he had to go to the bathroom after his fun. But as soon as he stepped outside, he was blocked by some of Scappa's henchmen. Scappa had sent people to keep an eye on Joe to prevent him from running away. The watchers saw him enter this den of iniquity and thought that he had been given money by his friend, did not want to pay and came here to flaunt it, so they called some buddies to block him. Unexpectedly, Joe had the intention of skipping out on the bill. This resulted in them getting no money and almost offending the Irish gang that ran the place. Fortunately, the security guard, Brian, had no intention of clashing with the Italians. He knew they were planning to squeeze money out of Joe, and since Joe was already planning a bank robbery, he explained that as long as Joe got money, he would only have to pay back 3 times today's cost. Otherwise, under normal circumstances, Joe would have to face serious consequences. What would happen if he failed to rob the bank? Would he die at the hands of the police or bank security? The Irish gang wouldn't even have to lift a finger. But while the threat of losing a limb was avoided, the Italians still needed to vent their anger. So Joe was dragged into the alley and given a good beating. As luck would have it, Tony Windus happened to be visiting at the same time. A confused Joe was then led by a waiter in front of the big shot. Although Tony Windus was only a tennis player, his status as Margaret's husband made him a big shot compared to ordinary gangsters, let alone someone like Joe, who was just a street thug. "Girls, you can step out for a moment. I need to have a little talk with this gentleman." After glancing at Joe, Tony Windus waved his hand to dismiss the 2 beauties beside him. The 2 women exchanged knowing glances and playfully rubbed against Tony Windus before obediently leaving the private room. "Please, sit down. Would you like a drink?" Tony Windus gestured for Joe to sit down. "A whiskey will do," Joe said, licking his lips at the whiskey in front of Tony Windus. After the beating, he desperately needed a drink to ease the pain. Tony Windus nodded and poured Joe a glass. "I hear you owe a lot of money," Tony Windus asked after Joe had taken a sip. "Yes, sir," Joe replied carefully, setting down his glass. "How much do you owe?" Tony Windus inquired again. $4,000, Joe answered succinctly. It wasn't much of a secret and there was no harm in telling. $4,000. Haha, you want to make some money. That's quite a sum. Tony Windus smiled and asked. "Sir, I don't quite understand what you mean." Joe blinked, unsure of the man's intentions. But he knew for sure that money didn't just fall from the sky. "Just answer me this. Do you want to earn this money or not?" Tony Windus replied. "But sir, I need to know what you want me to do." Joe couldn't help but ask. "Joe Barbaro, I know your situation. I know that if you don't pay up within a week, those mobsters will kill you. I also know that you're planning a bank robbery," Tony Windus said. "You really need the money. Then, sir, you must also know that sometimes the profit from kidnapping can be just as much as robbing a bank." Joe said, irritated by Tony's condescending, slightly threatening attitude. "Oh, is that so? Then you might be disappointed. I don't have any relatives except my wife, and frankly, my relationship with her is pretty bad. So even if you kidnap me, you won't get any money. Besides, I have a good relationship with Brian. Do you think that even if you got the ransom money, you'd have much chance to spend it?" Tony Windus said, unconcerned by Joe's threat. "You make a good point. So, sir, what exactly would you like me to do?" "What do you mean by a large sum of money?" Joe felt a little discouraged. $10,000, Tony Windus said, making sure the atmosphere was right, pronouncing each word clearly. "How much?" Joe immediately looked up in surprise. 10,000, Tony Windus repeated. "Done." Joe made his decision, on the spot. $10,000 was no small sum. It should be noted that in those days, the price for a professional hitman hired by the mafia was usually only around $2,000 to $4,000 for a single job. Although Joe still didn't know exactly what Tony Windus wanted him to do, he thought to himself, how could it possibly be worse than murder? Chapter 20. I want a divorce. Joe had no idea that his unintentional guess was correct. What Tony Windus wanted him to do was nothing less than commit murder. And the target was none other than Tony Windus' wife, Margaret, as well as Josh, Margaret's lover. Of course, the primary target was still Margaret. Didn't Margaret want a divorce? Didn't she want him out of the house? Then let her die. Once Margaret was dead, with no other relatives left, her vast fortune would naturally fall into his hands. But this was no simple matter of hiring a hitman. The gangland model of revenge simply did not work for the truly upper class. After all, in the free country of America, the real rulers are the capitalists. The so-called gangsters are mostly just lackeys picking up the crumbs of their profits. A similar example would be when the Hong Kong gangs were at their peak, daring to challenge the military and police. But unless you are a thug like Chung Zi-kyung who came to power from a middle-class family, has anyone heard of a local gangster taking on those wealthy families? If Tony Windus really dared to let Joe ruthlessly kill Margaret, what if one day Joe got caught and snitched on him? Even if the police didn't bother him, Margaret's father's friends wouldn't let him off the hook. So Tony Windus had to come up with a flawless plan to get himself completely off the hook, one that even if Joe did squeal, no one would believe. Before he called Joe, this plan had already taken shape in his mind. However, Tony Windus would not reveal the entire plan to Joe right away. "What I want you to do is not just one thing, but several. But don't worry, they're all simple," Tony Windus said slowly. "For example, the first thing is for you to follow my wife, take pictures of her with her having an affair with a person named Josh, and then look for an opportunity to steal her handbag. The $1,000 is your reward for this first step. As for the subsequent things, I will notify you after you complete them." "I understand," Joe nodded. Tony Windus's plan was unknown to Josh and Margaret. To Josh, Margaret's husband had been just a name. He had never even seen him. As for Margaret, a relatively naive rich housewife, she had no idea that her husband was so deranged that he wanted her dead just because they were fighting for divorce. The next day, wanting to avoid Tony Windus, Margaret left early to find Josh, not wanting to see him at all. When she arrived at Josh's house, Josh was chatting with his middle-aged neighbor, Tommy, over the fence in the yard. "Why are you here so early today? Let me introduce you. This is Mr. Thomas. Tommy. Angelo, my neighbor, a very friendly elderly man that I get along with very well," Josh said as he greeted Margaret and introduced his neighbor. "Hello Mr. Angelo. Nice to meet you. I'm Margaret." Margaret replied graciously to Josh's neighbor, though for some reason she didn't mention her last name. Maybe in her mind she thought the Windus last name wouldn't be hers for long. "Hello, pretty lady, you can just call me Tommy. Well, I won't bother you young people any longer. My flowers still need watering," Tommy said, smiling as he greeted Margaret, then shook the watering can in his hand as an excuse to finish his conversation with Josh. Looking at Margaret's demeanor, it was clear that she had a lot to tell Josh, and of course, being the older one, he didn't want to interrupt. "What's the matter? You look really down and a bit haggard," Josh said after Tommy had left, having also noticed Margaret's strange state. "Ah, is it that obvious?" When she heard Josh's words, Margaret instinctively touched her face, because she really hadn't slept well after the fight with Tony Windus. "Of course. Come in, it's cold out here. By the way, have you had breakfast?" Josh asked casually. Not yet," Margaret shook her head. The housekeeper usually prepared breakfast very early, but not wanting to face her husband, she had completely ignored it. "Just in time. I have some rolls I made this morning. I'll prepare them for you. We can talk more after you eat," Josh said immediately when he heard that Margaret hadn't had breakfast. Then the two of them entered the house. Josh had made the buns in the morning with flour he had bought at the farmer's market. The filling was fresh onion and beef, and they tasted pretty good. After they were done, he had even delivered some salad to Tommy's wife, who was also making breakfast. This was also the reason why he had chatted with Tommy earlier. Since he had crossed over to this era, Josh rarely got up late, and if he did, it wouldn't be after 8 in the morning. The main reason for this was that the entertainment options now are quite limited. No cell phones, no computers, no internet, no game consoles. There was television, but in this era, there was pitifully few shows, and the three major broadcast networks in America were mostly focused on radio. ABC hadn't even been officially formed yet. It was still part of NBC, known as the Blue Network. In addition, the crude shows of the era made it difficult for Josh to fit in. With all this in mind, Josh naturally had to keep an early schedule in order to stay healthy. Of course, there were still various brothels and other entertainment venues in the city at night, so the nightlife was not monotonous. However, previously, Josh's finances hadn't allowed him to experience this decadent, corrupt capitalist society. Today, perhaps because he was in a new house, he woke up before 6, when it was still dark outside, and decided to go to the farmer's market to see what good items were available. When he went yesterday, it had already been afternoon, so there were not many stalls left, and Josh had asked and learned that the farmer's market usually opened at 6 in the morning. Josh could only say that the working people in every country are indeed quite diligent. After reheating the buns, he also warmed up a glass of milk. Margaret was indeed very hungry, and she surprisingly finished 3 large meat buns without feeling satisfied. "So tell me, what's going on?" Josh asked after Margaret had finished. "My husband is back," Margaret said, "and I asked for a divorce." Meanwhile, after Josh and Margaret entered the house, Tommy, who was watering his flowers, seemed to sense something. He looked around and noticed a black car parked across the street, with someone inside who seemed to be looking at the next house. Seeing this, Tommy couldn't help but furrow his brow. Support the original author by checking out their book, links in the description.